Since the dawn of time, people have looked up at the evening sky and dreamed of traveling to Earth's nearest neighbor. On July 20th, 1969, as Neil Armstrong started down the ladder to the lunar surface, a dream as old as humanity was about to come true. In the years leading up to this moment, the American space program was plagued with failures and death. Many of the world's top scientists were certain a moon landing was impossible. This is the incredible story of the historic flight of Apollo 11. It was against the backdrop of the Cold War that the American and Russian race to the moon emerged. With the early Russian successes in space, the truly fearful West believed that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was fully capable of making good on his boast that the entire world would someday sleep under a red communist moon. The early American effort in space, however, proved disastrous at nearly every turn. As the entire world watched in wonder, the U.S. news media aptly supplied wide coverage to several ruinous missions, in sharp contrast to the highly guarded, top-secret Russian space program, of which little or nothing was known.
We were on the verge of having a robust capability that could take us to the moon. At least we could conceive of what it would look like on paper. But the actual systems we had at the time were relatively fragile and relatively unreliable. I remember looking at film of launches, frankly, most of which seemed to end up in a disaster rather than a successful launch to space.
I believe this was probably the most dangerous period of the space flight because the spaceships that we were flying were not particularly reliable. We had lost the Mercury Atlas 1 and 3 missions. Prior to the John Glenn, we had had problems on several of the Atlases. The technology was very primitive at that period of time.
Thus, at the height of the Cold War, the American Space Agency NASA held a distant and dismal second place to the formidable Russian space program, and America seemed destined to remain permanently overshadowed in space by the seemingly superior Russian program. The beginnings of the American successes that was to ultimately culminate with Apollo 11 started to surface during Project Mercury. During these missions, lone astronauts rode spacecraft into Earth orbit. Although fine accomplishments in and of themselves, the Americans were still a long way from walking on the moon's surface. Upon the completion of Project Mercury, NASA moved into Project Gemini, which was capable of transporting 2 astronauts. Still, the remaining technological hurdles were nothing short of daunting.
You got to remember, Mercury was not a maneuverable vehicle. Go down at all, no maneuvering capability. So that was the first thing we wanted to do, was maneuver. The second thing we wanted to do was, could it go find somebody up there? Could it go do a job up there? Could it go rendezvous with something? Could it go dock with something? Could you attach a rocket to it and go to someplace else? Those were all the things we were thinking about when we came to Gemini.
There were 4 major objectives of the Gemini program. Computer-controlled re-entry to improve guidance that would contribute to return from the moon guidance. That was one objective. Rendezvous of spacecraft was another objective, so that we could do lunar orbit rendezvous to come back from the moon. Long-duration flight, so that we could assure that the human could exist comfortably, or at least survive up to 2 weeks, which was the longest possible lunar mission that we might have. That was another objective. The final objective of the Gemini program, number 4, was space walking, or EVA, so we could convince ourselves that we could build the spacesuits and the human could operate independent of the spacecraft on the lunar surface. So all those 4 objectives really bridge the gap between Mercury and Apollo.
Project Gemini required not only perfection of brand new hardware, but the creation of new techniques to deal with time delays and testing the procedures for getting a spacecraft to the moon. An additional challenge was utilizing the vehicle's own pilot craft as the platform to return to Earth. Just as momentum was building within the U.S. space program, tragedy struck. 2 astronauts, Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, died in a plane crash during their Gemini training. Later, several other astronauts narrowly survived near-fatal accidents during the testing of the new Gemini technology. Given the monumental task and pace before them, many more things could have gone horribly wrong.
So it again was kind of a spooky experience. Again, we learned, and by the way, felt that we were being smiled on and watched over by someone smarter than us, because any of the things that we had run into could have turned out much worse than they did.
It was the mission of the Apollo program to master each technological feat and then land on the moon. Believing that astronaut casualties were now behind them, NASA forged ahead. Tragically, the 3 astronauts of the very first Apollo, Apollo 1, were instantly killed during a routine ground test. A flash fire in the capsule caused by a short circuit instantly ended the lives of talented astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. With NASA's moon goal seemingly beyond reach, little time was lost and the overall effort was accelerated. Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar lander in Earth orbit. And Apollo 10 took the lander module to the moon as a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. Each mission was integral to the first lunar landing attempt that was to be Apollo 11.
I think if there was anything that got us there, it was the tremendous effort of the people we had, and I think that can be emphasized too greatly in Apollo. It was the people that did it, and not any machines or any inventions or any one particular people's courage or astronaut courage or anything like that. It was an effort of a large number of people who really devoted their entire life to making it happen.
The crew of Apollo 11 was comprised of some of the most experienced and best trained of all astronauts. However, at the time missions were being assigned, no one knew which flight would be the historic trip to the moon. Apollo 11 commander was astronaut Neil Armstrong, a proven veteran of the Gemini program. In March 1966, he had previously commanded the first mission to rendezvous and dock with a target vehicle in space in Gemini 8. After he and his crewmate Dave Scott successfully docked with the target vehicle, a malfunctioning thruster caused the 2 spacecraft to spin out of control. Armstrong skillfully undocked the 2 vehicles without damage, although his spacecraft continued to spin to the point where both men nearly lost consciousness and the spacecraft almost spun out of control and off into outer space. In an amazingly cool manner, Armstrong identified the problem and stabilized the spacecraft with only seconds to spare. It was this sure confidence that earned Armstrong the commander post of the Apollo 11 mission. Those same skills once again saved Armstrong only weeks before the historic Apollo 11 mission. In the course of testing a research model of the lunar landing training vehicle, the vehicle malfunctioned and careened out of control. Again, with only seconds to spare, Armstrong ejected less than 75 meters just before the vehicle crashed. Had Armstrong remained inside, the accident would surely have resulted in a certain death. Armstrong's crewmate in the trip to the lunar surface was Colonel Buzz Aldrin, third in his class at West Point, who received a PhD in orbital mechanics from MIT prior to becoming an astronaut. It was Aldrin who more or less single-handedly rescued the Gemini program when he developed new spacewalk techniques during Gemini 12. Aldrin's successes in the last Gemini mission gave NASA the boost in confidence they needed to proceed with an aggressive moon landing schedule, and earned Aldrin his seat next to Armstrong on Apollo 11. The third crewmate on Apollo 11 was Michael Collins, another experienced Gemini astronaut who drew an assignment unique among astronauts. His mission was to remain in the orbiting command module while his crewmates used the lunar lander to descend to the moon. Collins was an expert in the techniques of rendezvous and docking, owing to his experience in Gemini 10 with John Young. During that mission, they rendezvoused and docked with two unmanned Agena vehicles and then used the Agena's boosters to set new altitude records. Originally, Collins was assigned to the first manned mission to orbit the moon on board Apollo 8, but was forced off that flight as a result of a bone spur in his neck that required minor surgery. He was later reassigned to the next available flight, Apollo 11. With a series of impressive accomplishments to their credit, the crew members of Apollo 11 were ready to take their place in history when launch day came on July 16, 1969.
Well, every launch day is a time of excitement, enthusiasm, and apprehension. But I think in most circumstances, you always feel that the chances of actually lifting off are fairly distant or remote. And you have to temper your enthusiasm with the realization that, in fact, you may be coming back in and trying to go another day.
I think the most memorable thing that I can recall about that particular day was the opportunity while my two friends here were being put into the spacecraft to stand alone by myself out there and look at the rocket, quietness, and see the sun come up and waves rolling in, and evidence of the millions of people watching, but nothing specific, and just so quiet. To realize that indeed that the contrast was going to take place, all the frantic activity preparing the rocket was so quiet up there for me personally. And that in a very few moments we were going to be departing in a great roar off for a momentous event.
Apollo 11 proved to be a textbook launch, setting the crew on course for their appointment with the moon. However, excitement was cautiously kept in check by the knowledge that space travel is a very unforgiving undertaking.
There are so many things that can go wrong on a trip to the moon and back. It's sort of a long and fragile daisy chain of events.
Of course, all three of us had flown in orbit before and seen the wonders of Earth as seen from space. This was a new experience for us in seeing it from a fairly long distance away. It does probably have a change in character as you become farther away. I think you most notice that, though, at the time you leave Earth. Departing at a great rate, it's very clear that this is an unusual experience.
Capcom, we're go for TLI.
Roger. Guys, I've got the word you wanted to hear. You are go for TLI. You're go for the moon.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. How do you read? Apollo 11, this is Houston. Radio check, over.
3 hours after liftoff, the Apollo command module moved forward to extract the lunar module from the third stage of the launch vehicle. Both were moving at 17,000 miles an hour, and afterwards the crew settled in for the 3-day trip to the moon.
Oh, loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are Doc. That's right.
From our point of view, the command module was a wonderful improvement over our previous spacecraft. It was really current. So we enjoyed the luxury of a big volume machine.
I thought we had amazingly good accommodations. We had hot and cold water. The food was even edible. All in all, it was a nicely packaged small enclosure, and we could comfortably have stayed there far in excess of 8 days.
I think it was a treat. It was certainly a major step upward. It was a marvel of technology, and had the company of two enjoyable people to keep us occupied. Things occasionally would get to drag a little bit on, I think, in a very long duration mission inside the command service module. But thanks to the experiences that we'd had previously in flight, we saw to it that there were adequate windows, and quite a few of them, to look out.
After traveling more than 250,000 miles across the emptiness of space, the spacecraft finally reached the moon and was readied for lunar orbit.
The thing about the moon that I thought was peculiar was that it seemed to depend on the angle of the sun. When the sun was almost overhead and it was noon down below, the moon appeared to be a warm and a friendly place. On the other hand, near dawn or dusk, it became very foreboding looking. The craters cast very long shadows, and the place looked distinctly unfriendly. So I was intrigued by the contrast based purely on what angle the sun happened to be coming from.
On the morning of July 20th, the anticipated moment of lunar orbit and descent had arrived. However, the true test of many years of preparation lay just ahead. Armstrong and Aldrin entered their lunar lander, named Eagle, and powered up the systems while Collins remained in the command module.
The spacecraft is behind the moon, and we go into what we call battle short in the control center. Battle short is where we actually physically block the circuit breakers and the main feeders for this building, such that if we'd have a power fault, we'd prefer to burn up the circuit rather than to have that circuit breaker open prematurely. As soon as GC says, hey, we're in battle short condition, we lock the doors to the room because we don't want anybody walking in and distracting us at critical times.
The first thing I heard was the flight director, Gene Krantz, come on the intercom, and he gave us a speech that I think General Patton would have been proud of. He said, "Folks, we're here. We are going to succeed. You've been trained. You know what to do, and we're going to go do it." But then he said something was even better. He said, "But no matter how it turns out, I'm going to be with you, and no matter what you do, I'm going to be right behind you." And you can't imagine what that meant to a bunch of young fellows who, like myself, were only 25 or 26 years old.
Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn, gonna go for undocking.
Okay, retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go.
Capcom, we're go for undocking. Hello, Eagle, Houston, we're standing by, over. Eagle, Houston, we see you on the steerable, over. Roger, Eagle, undock. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings. Roger. 000 9 or
I think
8.
perhaps the final descent to the lunar surface
Plus,
was,
correction,
for me, the highlight of the flight. It's very challenging, a lot of unknowns,
00085.
and it was, for a pilot, it was a wonderful experience.
030
As soon as the comm came in good and solid, we saw good telemetry data. The first thing that happened was I saw that there was a 20-foot per second velocity error in the onboard computer. Now that came from the fact that we'd started at the wrong place. We just couldn't predict perfectly where we were going to be and what speed we were going to be when we started the descent. The problem is, at 35 feet per second, we have to abort. So here we are riding right along this abort ledge, just inside it, and wondering, is this an initial error or is this something that's going to grow? Because if we had an accelerometer problem, a gyro problem, it was going to grow. We would have to call an abort. And that was something that was going to be my call, and I dreaded this sort of thing all along.
Okay, all flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Altitude 4200. Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Looking great.
Everything is good. We're back on track. I thought, boy, this is things are going to work out fine.
Go. Guidance, you happy? Go.
30 seconds later, after I thought things were going to work out fine, we got the first program alarm. If you listen to the tape, the crew talks about it first. You hear Neil Armstrong say, 1201, program alarm.
Top alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
1201 sounds, it's four little numbers, sounds sort of ah-ho-hum, but what it really means is, hey bud, I had too much to do that last second. I didn't get it all done, and I hope that I've done the most important things. And it's up to you to figure out if I've done the most important things, because I'm going on, I can't stop. And that's what that was all about.
15, 00, 9 or 8.
Well, when I saw those come up, my first thought, uh-oh, abort, you know, a computer, because always doing in a simulation, a computer glitch like that was the data dropped out, the computer stopped computing, and everything just went to, you know, hell in a handbasket.
030.
Just as the ground control engineers were trying to come to grips with understanding what caused the 1201 alarm, another series of alarms went off, indicating another potential situation hindering the moon descent.
Eagle looking great. Roger, 1202, we copy it.
Now, what we're concerned about, there's another computer alarm, which was called a PUDU, which means do program 00. Program 00 is where the computer says, hey, I don't have enough time to do anything. I'm going to go to idle and wait for further instructions. We were worried that we might force ourselves into that particular type alarm, and there we would have to, we'd either have to be in a landing position, select the abort guidance system, and try to land or abort. I mean, that was a bad case.
I look around and I see it's not coming too fast. I see that the velocity's okay, the altitude's okay. And about 10 seconds after the alarm, we call a go. I said, flight, we're going at alarm.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
Good radar data. We're now in the approach phase. Everything looking good.
Just right when the crew really needed it, because they called down and said, how are we doing? What's going on? Which is their way of saying, hey, what's going on? Give us a quick reading. We said go very confidently, and they put their head back in the cockpit and kept flying.
Altitude, velocity, light.
The tension in mission control was so real you could cut it with a knife, and I'm just babbling along on these, you know, giving them updates and this and that and the other. And Deke Slayton was sitting right next to me during that final few minutes, and about the last minute, he hit me in the side and said, whispered, "Shut up, Charlie, and let them land." And so I got real quiet.
Velocity light.
I get a call from the controllers that says, hey, we've hit the DIPS, which is Descent Propulsion System, low level discrete. And that sets my mental clock running and the clock of all the controllers in the room running that, hey, we only got 2 minutes of hover time, hover fuel remaining. And we know the crew isn't down near the surface yet. And pretty soon this clock, this time starts moving agonizingly slow down here. And then next call we get is 60 seconds. We still haven't landed in the moon, and we're well beyond our experience base for landing there. We get another call at 45 seconds, still haven't landed.
In our simulations, we're accustomed to having a large number of these kinds of difficulties, and we had in fact simulated landing with very small amounts of fuel left, so I didn't feel that this was an oppressive situation. Not that we weren't concerned about it, we certainly were, because there were serious matters.
We get down at 30 seconds, we get a 30-second call, and at this time, over the voice path from the crew, the aircraft from the crew, you start hearing we're kicking up dust. So we now knew we were pretty close down to the surface. At which time, all we did from then on, we weren't communicating with the crew except for very terse call-outs on time. 30 seconds, 15 seconds.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
We were close. I think we were within 10 to 7 seconds of fuel before we landed. We were about 6 seconds away from the ground calling an abort. That wouldn't have been my call. That would have been another engineers in this room. But he was within a few seconds.
My problem was I had to keep talking. I had to keep working because I had a series of stay-no-stay decisions that we had to make. Because in case the LEM spacecraft had been damaged during the descent, or some of the temperatures, possibly we got into a soft landing area where it started to tip off, we had to be ready to abort at any time. So I had to keep my controllers, my entire team grinding away for what we call the T1 stay-no-stay decision.
The things you have to hang on to are your buddies down here that are right there with you, and the flight director is going to stand behind you no matter what. And even though you're scared, you can function and operate. Now, I'm not saying everybody in this room was scared. I was always scared. I was scared during the sim. I was scared during the mission. I don't have any problem saying that.
The technological problems of landing aside, at least one renowned scientist had great fears as to whether Armstrong and Aldrin would even survive the landing. Some predicted that the dust covering the moon's surface would explode upon contact with the lunar lander's engines.
That issue arose because of a scientist by the name of Thomas Gold, who tended to take a little bit of data and make extreme extrapolations from it. And he convinced a senator and some high-ranking NASA officials that this was a problem, that the moon dust would ignite. There was a piece of evidence that he had from the pictures from the Surveyor spacecraft that showed that dust was collecting on the spacecraft, and this meant it was hopping around with electrical charges and could get in the Apollo module and ignite and so on.
Ultimately, this fear proved groundless, and the first successful landing on the moon's surface became history. For the moment, the crew had to push aside any remaining anxiety and anticipation for their walk on the moon. There was still work to be done and checkouts to be performed inside the lunar excursion module before venturing outside. Through the window of the Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin took in what no human had seen before.
We had hours to stand there a mere 15 feet, say, above the surface and look at pretty much everything that was available out the front windows. We had a sense of the gravity, the character of the environment there. So long before we actually got out on the surface, we already had pretty good appreciation for what the moon was like.
The crew, as they had been trained, were looking out the windows, and they were describing the terrain that we had landed in. As the crew was describing this, I could see the puzzlement on the controllers' faces that said, this isn't where we expected to be. Well, that was obvious because we had landed long. But we thought from the crew description we'd be able to plot the position, and the geologists in the back room were confused.
On Sunday, July 20th, 1969, almost 7 hours after touchdown, it was a go for the crew's historic moonwalk. As more than 1 billion people simultaneously watched on their televisions, momentarily brought together by this unprecedented event, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin readied themselves to turn an age-old dream into reality. Tempering the astronauts' eager anticipation to walk the lunar surface was the lingering fear of potential danger and death.
And that the astronauts would step off out of the spacecraft and sink out of sight if the spacecraft hadn't already sunk out of sight, that they needed snowshoes to walk around because there was going to be all this incredible depth of dust and so on.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston?
Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture. You're in our field of view now.
Okay, ready for me to come out? All set. Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one step to the next. You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th rung up. There you go. Okay, now I think I'll do the same.
The first thing you do, first thing we did when we got out of that spacecraft was go get some rocks. Do nothing else, just just pick up some rocks, put them in a bag, and put that in the spacecraft in case we had to get the hell out of there. That's what we did. Okay, we've done that and we're satisfied everything's okay on the moon. Now we'll go put out the instruments. We did that. And what's the minimum instruments you can have on this flight? Because we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the moon. We want to get off of there. We want to come back and think about all this stuff and make sure that we did it right and that everything was okay.
I think I was relieved by the ease that we had in being able to move around. Perhaps impressed by the talcum powder nature of the fine surface itself. As you look at a blueprint, it just was so smooth, just like you just put your foot in talcum powder. It was just a many-faceted moon. It was a stranger to me before the mission, but I now look back at it as somewhat of a friend, a place that I've visited.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Powder is very, very fine powder, isn't it? Isn't it fine? Hey, Neil, didn't I say we might see some purple rocks? Find the purple rocks? Yep. Very small
With about 2.5 hours allocated for the moonwalk, most of the time was dedicated to collecting rocks, planting the American flag, and erecting a few key scientific experiments.
When we first had to interface with the scientists, the paleontologists, planetologists, and the geologists, and the seismologists, and all those learned doctors, they didn't like us worth a damn. They wanted to do all this fancy science on the moon. That wasn't our job at the time. Our job was to get that goddamn thing there and back safely. The guys that flew in it safely. And I would say, look, don't bother me with that now. Tell me what's the minimum amount I can do to satisfy you, and let me go get it done.
One of the experiments consisted of a package to detect moonquakes and meteorite impacts, while a laser-ranging reflector helped to accurately measure Earth-Moon distances, and a solar wind experiment detected particles of solar wind blowing onto the lunar surface.
When we're on the surface of the moon, even though the Earth was only a slight 24 degrees off the vertical, there was no traction on my part to divert my attention from where we were and what we were doing, to look up at it, except for the one time when we tried to take a moving picture, or a stirring picture, a memorable picture. And certainly, in retrospect, we looked awfully small. Personally, there was a time when an ironic thought sort of filtered through my mind that here Neil and I were so far away from home, much further than people have ever been, and yet at that same time there were more thoughts, concerns back so far away on what it is we were doing at that very moment.
After 2 hours and 31 minutes, the astronauts completed their work on the moon and returned to their lunar lander. With no wind or rain on the moon, the footprints of Armstrong and Aldrin will remain for centuries. Astronaut Collins remained behind to pilot the command module named Columbia and was orbiting the moon. During this time, he had occasion for much serious contemplation. A minor functional error could leave him floating in space forever.
Well, I enjoyed being in the command module by myself. It was a happy little home. All the machinery was working properly, and my concerns were not within the command module, but simply that something might go wrong with the LEM, with the lunar module, and these two guys might get stuck on the surface of the moon. That was my main concern.
Ascent back into lunar orbit.
Capcom, Ecom, Surgeon, GNC. Guidance, you happy? Go. Fido. Go. Capcom, we're go for liftoff.
Tranquility Base, Houston, you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway.
Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the entire mission was the ascent phase, when the astronauts lifted off from the lunar surface. Nearly every system of the mission was equipped with backups, double redundant machinery and equipment, with the exception of one. There could be only one lightweight engine that would lift the crew up and off the lunar surface. If the engine failed to start, astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin would have become permanent monuments on the moon.
Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride. There's that one playground there.
Thousand feet high, 80 feet per second vertical rise.
Eagle Houston, you're looking good at 2. Ping, zags, and misspin all agree.
On July 21st, the Ascent engine performed perfectly, and the Eagle spacecraft and crew said goodbye to the moon.
Everything's great.
Commander Collins and the command module, the approaching Eagle was a welcome sight. After docking together, Armstrong, Aldrin, and their priceless cargo of moon rocks were transferred into the command module. The lunar lander was jettisoned and ultimately fell back and crashed on the moon. The crew was anxious to return home, but they were still 3 days and 250,000 miles away.
The key thing is this business that we're in is absolutely intolerant of carelessness, neglect, incapacity. There's a lot of surprises. There's a high risk. There's nothing conservative about the business that we're in. Basically, we hold back until we are absolutely sure that our job is done. Then we will sit back and we'll celebrate.
On July 24th, Apollo streaked across the heavens headed towards Earth at 25,000 miles an hour, and the Navy rescue team was right there to greet them when the parachutes came out.
I think in 11, from my personal standpoint, we brought the flags out in. And I think that sort of said, hey, thank God for America, and thank God for this country that has let us work in such a marvelous program. And we passed around cigars in this thing here, and this is when we could smoke in the control center. And people would do this, and we'd light up the cigars. And that was, hey, our thanks to the team. Then we met with the other crews and the program managers. We opened the doors to this room. And these hundreds of people would come into the room, all of whom had one little piece of this mission, but without whom we couldn't have done this mission. There was just a feeling of togetherness, bond, unity, accomplishment. It was just the most marvelous feelings in my entire life that existed in this room.
Due to a very real fear that the astronauts could ferry back with them moon germs or some other alien life form capable of contaminating and killing off all life on Earth, the crew was immediately put into strict quarantine for over 2 weeks. By the middle of August, the journey was over, and the crew was safely returned home to Houston, where they went on to become 3 of the greatest heroes in the history of humanity. Although some argue that the moon missions cost too much for too little, the Apollo program was truly a bargain. It cost taxpayers a sum amounting to only 1/3 of 1% of the gross national product in 1970. Yet the technical and scientific knowledge gained from it was immeasurable and still yields benefits today. In the decades that have passed since those first footsteps on the moon, Apollo 11 remains as one of the greatest achievements in the history of human endeavors. The moon was not the finish line, but merely the first step in the eventual exploration of the universe.
There's an increasing momentum to go back to the moon. Studies of the moon are indicating more and more new reasons why it does make sense to go back, but I'm not in a position to say right now when we might make that next trip.
I'd prefer to see us go to Mars rather than go back to the moon, unless we need the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. It could be that in studying Mars, you will discover that the best way to do it is by way of a base on the moon, and if that turns out to be the case, well and good, but I see the moon really not as an end in itself, but really a stepping stone to deeper space, to Mars and to the planets beyond.
I feel that as humans expand outward, that they should be in a gradual, continuous, self-sustaining way, and I suspect that it will involve visiting the moon simultaneously or in melding together with our growing visits of humans to Mars.
I am encouraged by the fact that there are so many people asking those questions, which seems to assure me that our future has a great deal of promise.
Well, I think a Martian astronaut would probably be better off studying the voyages of Vasco da Gama or Lewis and Clark rather than he would listening to the three people who spent only 8 days out on the road. Round trip for a Mars mission is going to be in the vicinity of 2.5 years, and that's close in duration to those of the early explorers.
I think Mike's right. The trip to Mars is going to be a very long and involved and major segment of a person's life, and there's going to be a lot of times to be thinking about it, discussing it en route, beforehand, and afterward. The nation needs a strong goal, strong objective, and Mars is a much clearer one to use as our compelling drawing force into the future.
Well, I think clearly if you were a hitchhiker and were picked up by any of the lunar missions, 12 would have been the one that would have been fun to tag along on. You know, they were all these Navy buddies. I mean, like I think Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon had been wingmates on a carrier before, you know. I mean, like they'd all known each other, flown together, felt comfortable together, and they had a gas. You know, I mean, like, you can tell listening to the tapes from those days. I mean, they had a lot of fun when they went. And hopefully everybody had at least some fun, you know, I mean, but they're the ones that you really, there's no question in your mind. These guys had a good time.
I feel that way. I thought the three of us have always been fairly close. We've had a relationship prior to ever being in the space program. And it was a very comfortable feeling. To fly together. I've always accused Pete and I of being together so often we think alike and we can communicate without speech. And it's a very unique experience. I don't think any other crew comes to that point.
We had trained as a crew. We were the backup crew for Apollo 9, and then we trained, which it was maybe a year and a half or two of training, And then we were the prime crew for Apollo 12, which is another 9 months of training, and we were real good at it as a crew.
When we first had to interface with the scientists, the paleontologists, the planetologists, and the geologists, and the seismologists, and all those learned doctors, they wanted to do all this fancy science on the moon. We let them design Apollo 12, the scientists. We said, where do you want to go? Where's the next place you want to go? Where do you want to land? You tell us exactly where you want to land, and we will land exactly there. You go plan the whole damn what you want these guys to do. You want what you want them to look at, what you want to find at this site. You train our crews to exactly what you need from them. You do this with the Surveyor, the whole bit. You tell us exactly what you want, and we will do it.
Pete Conrad and all of us were very good friends. Pete was one of the, as many people know him, he's a very gregarious, funny, typical, maybe a stereotype of the test pilot who, you know, get into anything and fly it, that sort of thing. And in the Apollo 12 crew, with he and Dick Gordon and Al Bean were just a delight to work with. They were a lot of fun.
The rocket itself was almost like 40 stories tall, you know, and that's more than the Statue of Liberty. I think it's on a par with the Washington Monument, I'm not sure, and every inch of it is full of exploding fuel. You know, I mean, it's equivalent to sitting on top of an H-bomb or an A-bomb. I mean, there's enough of a bomb to do where you don't care what kind of bomb it is. I mean, you're gone if it doesn't work right.
Here we are, spent all our lives in a risk environment. You acknowledge that fact going in, and you don't dwell on it. You don't let it bother you. If the damn thing blows up, you're going to be dead. That's the least of the consequence. I'd rather do that than get smashed up and spend the rest of my life as an invalid.
You spent 6, 7 years eating, sleeping, breathing, doing this job.
Sure.
And we were really spring-loaded trained. The only time you ever saw anything normal was when you flew the flight.
Here are these guys that have spent all their lives learning how to fly, learning to be pilots, be at the controls, and during launch there's really very little they can do except for just strap in and ride it.
Getting in the spacesuit in the morning and riding the van out to the pad and riding the elevator up to the top and getting in the command module, all that is so interesting and so amazing. Just thinking about it now is kind of amazing.
The heart rates that they monitored in mission control, I mean, like almost invariably showed higher heart rates during launch than at any other portion of the flight, including when they would land on the moon. Because when they're landing, they're driving it. You know, when they're blasting off, they're just sitting there. And they were as scared as they ever got.
I can recall the fellow in the house of in the mission control was counting down 10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start, 7, 6. Now, he said that, but still his engines are 360 feet away, so I didn't feel anything. And 4, 3, when he said 3, then I began to feel a shaking and a rattling. And when I was observing, as I observed the shaking and rattling, it was more than I imagined. It was more than I thought was safe. And I can recall thinking, maybe this is going to come apart. Maybe this is shaking more than it should, certainly more than any airplane I'd ever been on. It just was tremendous vibration. And as this ran through my head, I hear him say, 1 liftoff.
Pete Conrad reports that your program is in. Tower clear.
I'm pitching a roll program, and this baby is really going.
We launched on Apollo 12, and about 30 seconds into the mission, we got hit by lightning. And we never practiced that. No one imagined that could happen in space. And it lit up more caution and warning lights than had ever been on any space flight before since. I mean, there was nothing close to this. And they all came on, and Pete started reading them off. And he read almost every light up there, particularly anything that had to do with the electrical system.
I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. I'm not sure we get hit by lightning. Fuel cell lights and AC bus light, fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
It turned out that when the lightning hit, it more or less knocked everything out on the spacecraft. But luckily, the booster wasn't affected, so the big Saturn V kept pushing and getting us up higher, and I thought we might have to abort, but there was no reason to rush into it because we were gaining altitude, which was a safer condition.
The curious thing about it is Dick, who normally gives me good advice. He leaned over, he read a few lights, and I'm thinking, maybe he'll tell me what to do. He didn't tell me a doggone thing. He went back and started talking to Pete, and so I was sitting over still not knowing what to do. Fortunately, the ground had a good idea of what had happened. They'd observed it, and they made some suggestions, which I implemented, and everything turned out okay.
Al did a great job getting the electrical system back online during the boost phase. So
That's right.
really
That's the first time you never helped him.
I know it. I didn't know what to do. It was my vehicle, and I didn't know what to do.
Okay, we're all organized again, John. We've had a couple of cardiac arrests down here too, Pete.
I was fortunate enough and I got onto the problem quickly enough and made the call to the flight director to fix it. And of course, he told me later, Jerry Griffin, that when the call came, he didn't think the call was going to be about a fix. He thought the call was going to be about an abort. And so it was a harrowing experience to get that vehicle into Earth orbit.
But I can tell you the adrenaline was really pumping. And it sounds a lot cooler to me now that I listen to it than I remember it. I remember it as being very, very, it got my attention. Let me say it that way.
We got to Earth orbit, got things back online, and couldn't find anything wrong with the vehicle. Seemed to pass all of our tests, and we were faced with well, that was pretty exciting, but everything is working here, so shall we come home or shall we get on with it?
Somebody had said, hey, we'd get struck by lightning, we'd decouple the command and service module guidance from the S4B. We'd go into orbit in that thing, and 3 hours later we'd be on our way to the moon. I'd say, you're crazy. You couldn't check the spacecraft out. There's no way we could do that, yet we did.
Apollo 12, Houston, the good word is you're go for TLI.
Hoopy-doo, we're ready. We didn't expect anything else.
We didn't train for anything else, Pete.
You better believe it.
We have data and thrust is go. Burn looks good.
No, I remember looking at the window saying, I hope that doesn't break. You know, still you can see through it. I'm going to die. That's a feeling that I haven't had much of my life, that death was 5 inches away.
After a while, you'd see the moon would go by, and then after a little while, the sun would go by in the window, and after a little while, the Earth would go by. And you began to understand how, back in the old days, man began to evolve his understanding of the world and the universe. We began to think we were the center of the universe because it all went by the windows as we looked out.
And I can remember looking back at the Earth and seeing it go. At first it goes away very fast, almost like the fastest elevator. And it's big and it's starting to get small, but it's going away. And you're thinking, boy, everybody's going away that I've ever known. They're going that way, and the three of us are going this way. And it kind of is shocking. And I can remember looking at the Earth when it got about that big then and thinking, you know, everybody I've ever known, they're all back there. And here we are. There's billions back there. Here we are here. And it's kind of scary, but I wanted to be there, but still kind of frightening.
We're trying all these things that we didn't have in Gemini, like toothpaste and shaving, and we're really having a ball up here.
Roger. All dressed up and no place to go.
Oh, we're going someplace. We can see it getting bigger and bigger all the time.
Dick Gordon told me that he had this trick on the way out there because, you know, when you go to the bathroom, you would save a lot of it. You know, they'd have these feces bags, you know, I mean, like that they were supposed to bring home. And Gordon used to put them in the food compartment, hoping that Bean would grab one for a midnight snack or something, you know? I mean, these were guys that they went to the moon with a sense of humor.
I wouldn't do anything like that. And hope somebody got up for a midnight snack? Sure.
Apollo 12, Houston.
Hello, Houston. Yankee Clipper with Intrepid in tow has arrived on time. I guess like everybody else that just arrived, all three of us are plastered to the windows looking.
When we were falling towards the moon, I had no idea that we wouldn't fall right into the middle of it and get killed. And the computer said we wouldn't, said we'd go behind it about 60 miles. But there was no way to tell it. So there's your life and future is more contained on numbers in computer programs in spaceflight than it is in airplanes. I'd look at the computer and it'd be printing out, not printing up something, but reading out something. I'd think, I hope this thing keeps running. Because if it doesn't, we got a big problem.
Our motion to the left is not as apparent as our motion towards the moon, and therefore we have the decided impression that we're going right into the center of that baby right now. Okay, Houston, we're maneuvering to the burn attitude.
Roger, we copied that, 12.
We're beginning to go into darkness at this time.
Roger, 12.
Matter of fact, we're there.
Hello, 12, Houston, you're go for LOI.
Roger, Houston, go for LOI. Burn checklist is complete to -6 minutes, and we're holding at that point.
The whole thing was, as Neil and Buzz didn't land where they were supposed to. They were 4 miles from where they were supposed to. So it befell on us and engineers to figure out why they didn't land where they were supposed to.
NASA decided to demonstrate this by landing near a crater that was a specific crater, a crater where a Surveyor unmanned spacecraft had landed some 33 months earlier. So they targeted us for this crater, and we targeted for the center of this crater, which was 656 feet in diameter. And I can remember us thinking, boy, I don't know where we're landing, but it'd be nice if we landed near there. Not in the middle, but we'll target there.
They picked Surveyor 3 because it was way down a Copernican ray, and they thought that the material around that came from deep within the crater Copernicus and would not be the same as lunar surface material. So that's how the site actually got evolved down to the particular Surveyor 3.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Houston out, over.
Okay, it's go there, Capcom on the hot fire. Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn, gonna go for undocking. Okay, retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Well, we went to the moon, 239,000 miles away, made several orbits, came down to land, and when our lunar module pitched over, Pete looked out the window and could see where we were going to land.
Pitching over at 7,500 feet, expecting to see the snowman crater pattern and seeing 10,000 craters out there. I'll never forget that, and not having the foggiest idea where it was.
Okay, you're out of 19,000 feet. I got some kind of a horizon out there. I got some craters too, but I don't know where I am yet. Okay. In a Viper P-64. Okay. I'm trying to cheat and look out there. I think I see my crater. Hey, baby. I'm not sure. Coming through 7.
I read from the computer a system of numbers, which he could look through some marks on the window with and see where, if we didn't touch it, where it was actually going to land. He looked through the window and we would land right in the center of Surveyor crater, just where we were targeted.
Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road. Outstanding. 42 degrees, Pete. Hey, it's started right from the center of the crater. Look out there. I can't believe it. Amazing. Fantastic. 42 degrees, babe. Just keep talking. Slide it in. Coming down at about 99 feet a second. You're looking good.
Traffic Houston, go for landing.
Over one. Okay, Roger. 40 degrees, LPD, Pete. 40 degrees. So fantastic, I can't believe it.
Getting to land. That's the shortest flight time in the world, that 1 minute and 30 seconds or less, whatever it was you had on the stick. That's the only time you flew it. And I really did have to fly it. That where we were supposed to land was not suitable. It had big boulders in it, and I had to fly it a little bit further around.
Hey, you're really maneuvering around. Yeah. Come on down, Pete. Okay. 10% fuel. 200 feet, coming down at 3. Come on down. Okay. 180 feet. 9%, you're looking good. Gonna get some dust before long. 96 feet, coming down at 6. Slow down the descent rate. 80 feet, coming down at 4. You're looking good. 50 feet, coming down. Watch for the dust. 40 coming down at 2. Looking good. Watch the dust. Coming down at 2 feet. You got plenty of gas. Plenty of gas, dude. Hang in there.
30 seconds.
18 feet, coming down at 2. He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light.
Roger, copy contact.
Pro. Yes, pro.
To go back to Apollo 11, a newspaper person who was a friend that was also foreign, and I thought had reasonably leftist leanings, and anyhow, we were having this discussion, and this person was absolutely convinced that the United States government propaganda office somewhere had written these great words for Neil to say.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Then I said, okay, if you think that that's the case, we'll sit down here and we'll figure out what I'm going to say. So I figured I'd say something to the effect, it may have been a little one for Neil, but it was a big one for a little fellow like me, seeing I was the shortest person in the office.
Down to the pin. Okay. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
I bet this person $500, which was a reasonably large sum of money in those days. I thought that if I could get $500 off a communist, that was probably pretty good. Person then realized that there wasn't propagandists, but they reneged on the bet, and I never won the money. I was never paid.
Hey, Al, you can work out here all day. Just take your time. Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. Dum-dum-dum-dum.
I would just feel good. It's a good feeling because everything about you is lighter, and so I felt stronger. I felt like this is a great day. You know, I can jump. Look how high I can jump. Look at how light this is. I just grab this and move it over here, and normally it's pretty heavy. So it gave me a feeling of being strong and fast and feeling good.
Man, does that limb look small back there?
Pete, now we show you're 1,200 feet from the limb.
Okay. You know what I feel like, Al? You ever see those pictures of giraffes running in slow motion? That's exactly what I feel like.
They tried to rush through and get us the first color television camera. And it was the old system, you know, it was a camera that had a color wheel in it, and for all our training, all we had was a block of wood. And I think this camera showed up like 3 days before the flight, and Al and I never laid eyes on it.
Okay, what change did you make? I hit it on the top with my hammer. I figured we didn't have a thing to lose.
Al was setting it up, and he waved the camera around, and he wound up pointing it into the sun, and it did not have a light level sensor, and so it burned the camera out.
Being on the moon is you're unprepared for visually what everything looks like. I mean, like, there's no sense of scale or distance, you know. I mean, like, even out in the desert, you know, you see a telephone pole a half a mile away, you know. I mean, to where, like, that telephone pole cues you what your distances are. There's nothing on the moon. You know, there is no way to tell how far away anything is.
Shortly after the flight, somebody asked him, how did you guys navigate on the moon? And Al said, I don't know, I just followed Pete. I had a hard time finding what the right craters, just because I didn't lose my sense of direction, but I sure wasn't really positive which crater was which.
How about a grapefruit-sized rock? That's what I'm holding in my hand, and these other rocks that I was talking to you about are pretty well buried and they're pretty large. I don't think I could get one of them going. Houston? Roger, we copy grapefruit size or any size is fine.
Well, I mean, it's just a big round rock, and we were at the point of collecting unusual samples.
That's not,
so here was it.
That's not the way it goes, Pete. That was the extent of Bean and Conrad's knowledge of geology.
True. That's true.
And as much as they tried to learn geological terms, they came up with a grapefruit rock.
I thought that was very descriptive. The scientists on the ground had a very good mental picture of what that rock looked like.
Yeah, like a grape starting to come in. Hey, I'll tell you what we're parked next to. Yeah. We're about 25 feet in front of the Surveyor traces.
The backup crew must have gone through a library of Playboy magazines,
right,
and kept clipping out Miss Playboy or the month or this, that, and the other thing, interspersing those pictures throughout the checklist.
Got through those pages, and I had to turn the page again, and then wound up with the Playmate of the Month, and I that one really did take me by surprise. I was not expecting that at all, and of course I couldn't say anything about it over the radio, so I was doing a lot of laughing, and people they weren't sure why I was laughing, but I don't think they wanted to ask why I was laughing either. So you know, some of the outside people thought that I was being very frivolous, and I might have even been intoxicated on the moon, but that wasn't the case at all. I was just laughing at these in-jokes, and I obviously couldn't talk about them over the air.
The several times that I fell down up there, usually from backing up and hitting a rock or something like that, I would fall so much more slowly on the moon than I did on the Earth, that I never was in danger of puncturing myself. If I started to fall backwards, on Earth I'd just go plunk. But there, falling slowly with that light gravity, I could usually turn around and just catch myself very easily with my hands, and then I could just push like that and push right back up.
Al and I wanted to come up with a gimmick to sort of fool the PR guys, and so I went and got a timer that fits the Hasselblad, and I snuck that on board, and Al and I were going to go over and stand next to the Surveyor and have both our pictures taken, you see. And we knew that these guys would take one look at that and they'd say, man, that's the picture, and they'd launch it to the world before somebody would ask the question, who took the picture? Got out, put the thing in the bottom of our rock collecting bag. I suddenly realized now we're going to get next to Surveyor. I got to get that timer out of the bottom of this bag, which is now completely full of rocks. And so we can't talk. We can't talk about it, so we're giving each other sign language. And the ground says, it's time for you guys to take a rest.
Get in there. Get in that bag. There you go. In the bag. In the bag. In the bag? Now, wait a second. Yeah, I got to zip it up. Good Joe. Copy it's in the bag.
Well, we're supposedly taking a rest, except we're hauling rocks out and holding them in our arms, and we're working our can off. And obviously our heart rate is not going down, and though they're saying, doesn't look like you're resting, what are you doing, or whatever, you know, we're saying, oh, nothing, we're resting, and our heart rate, and we're digging around and digging around and digging around. Make long story short, I never could find this thing. It just eluded me.
Yankee Clipper, Houston. Hello, Houston. Clipper here. Clipper, you were sort of a forgotten man for a little while. We're all eyes are on you now. We're with you.
The command module pilots were the only people who were ever by themselves. You know, I mean, the other two guys would go down and land on the moon, and they were real busy all the time. They had mission control talking to them constantly. So they never had time to just kind of sit back and think about where they were. But the command module pilots, I mean, like, stayed in orbit all by themselves, half of which they were on the dark side of the moon and couldn't even talk to Earth if they wanted to. So they had plenty of time to kind of sit back and just look around and realize, wow, I'm at the moon.
We did train, or I did train to return by myself. Went through all of the mission activities that I would have had to have operated the command module by myself as opposed to having three people. But I never concerned myself with that, and I knew they were going to come back. It would have been a very, very unpleasant day if they hadn't, let me tell you. That'd have been 3 days of pure, not terror, but real sorrow to come back alone. I don't even like to contemplate that.
I don't either.
Well, I'm sure you don't.
No?
We show you're 3 hours and 7 minutes into it, into the EVA, and we'd like you back to the LEM to start the closeout in 10 minutes. That's at 3 + 17.
At the smoke to get back to that lamp, we're a long way. Okay, and then we ought to dust each other off. Man, we are filthy. Okay, coming up the ladder. Gosh, you're shaking the whole mill. Sorry about that.
They're back inside getting ready to go, and of course, you know, I mean, they've got their big checklist, and Bean is working like crazy, so he's got everything ready to go about 2 hours beforehand. And he's got nothing to do but sit there and be nervous.
And the ground wasn't saying anything, and all of a sudden, I began to think, do we still have radio contact, you know, with the ground? Because nobody had said anything for quite a long period. So we called him and asked him, and Pete said to me, I can remember him saying, "You getting a little nervous?" I said, "Yeah."
"But you'll get over it." I said, "You know, this is your first ride." I said, "Besides, Al, if it doesn't light, look at it this way. We become the first permanent monument to the U.S. space program on the moon."
I said, "Yeah, that makes me feel real good."
Conrad had just sort of scratched that itch for a couple hours, you know. I mean, like, that's the way astronauts were, you know. I mean, and of course, you know, 12 went just fine.
Pete punches the button, 5 seconds, big bang as these bolts blow. And so looking out the window, it was like riding a very fast elevator. And so up we go off the moon. And I'm looking out the window, and I'm looking at the computer and looking out the window. And as we go up, it goes up to 60 feet, about straight up. And then it pitches over, it starts to get velocity. We had to burn 6 minutes and 5 seconds to get into orbit. And there's no gauges really on your ascent stage engine to see how it's doing. The idea being, if it isn't doing okay, what are you going to do about it?
316 feet above the lunar surface. Boy, you're just right. Quiet. File, I don't know what. 30 seconds. 30 seconds, 177. 1,594 feet above the lunar surface. That's pretty good. We're on our way. And in 1 minute, all right, 20 feet. Okay.
And Pete leaned over to me and he says, "You know, Al, how would you like to fly this thing?" And I thought, well, that'd be fun, because I hadn't flown it up to that time. I'd just been doing my part of the job. And so as I started to put in my first thrust, I said, wait a minute, the people down in Houston at Mission Control aren't going to like this. And he said, don't worry, we're on the backside of the moon, they'll never know it. And sure enough, he thought of everything. And so I flew it around a while and felt good to do it. It was just a good memory of a commander that thought about his lunar module pilot and wanted to get him to enjoy the flight.
I have heard the story about Al flying the lunar module, or Pete letting Al fly the lunar module, but we couldn't tell that on the ground. And if they did it when we weren't looking, or they did it in a way that we couldn't tell. I only heard the story after they got back. Sometimes I wonder about stories, you know, after years pass, they tend to get better and better. But I suspect it wouldn't surprise me at all that Pete turned it over to Al and let him fly it for a while.
The command module pilot is the one who's basically in charge. The lunar module is passive, and the guy comes in and docks with them and takes them home. And that's a very difficult rendezvous and docking. And the two pilots of the two ships have to know each other pretty well.
Okay, everything's tied down, but man, oh man, is it filthy in here. We must have 20 pounds of stark dirt, all kinds of junk.
That'll be an interesting zero-G.
Al and I think look like a couple of bituminous coal miners right at the moment. We're happy.
So are a lot of people down here.
We were very dirty, and was all this lunar dust was floating around in there. When we got up in rendezvous, Dick took one look at us and said, "I don't let you guys in there. You look like a bunch of coal miners or whatever." So we started. We finally figured out that we'd undress in the LEM and pass it up to Dick. But the more we got undressed, the dirtier we kept getting in our underwear and everything else. So the next thing I knew, we're down to our all together. And so not only were we the first lunar streakers, but I guess I figured that if something happened and it blew up when we jettisoned it, why, I'd go out of this world the way I came in with nothing on.
But somehow going fast again made me feel like we were headed back home. And I think that Neil Armstrong said that the time he felt like they were going to pull off the mission is when he got in orbit. And I agreed, because you're going fast again. You feel like once you're going fast, you don't have to go a little bit faster, and then you can head on home. So it was a really good feeling to get into orbit.
We have acquisition of signal.
Apollo 12, Houston. Oh, Houston, Apollo 12, en route home. Very good. Apollo 12, Houston, we're ready for TV anytime you want to send some down to us. Okay, we're trying to get into a good position right now. The thermal one is a little bit later, but we're leaving the moon so fast we thought we better keep it.
Our trajectory was such on the way home that about 100,000 miles out, it was 100, wasn't it? That we nipped in the line where the Earth fully eclipsed the sun, and we were between the Earth and the moon. And so what we had was an absolute full moon behind us, and for the first time, an eclipsed night Earth, so that there was no sun, and instead of seeing a black, as you see in the photographs, you don't see the night Earth. What we did see was the full night Earth in moonshine, in full moonshine. We could see the land masses, we could see thunderstorms from 100,000 miles out, we could distinguish the ocean and the clouds, and I think we're the only ones that saw that.
The command module hit the atmosphere at a pretty good speed. I mean, like, you know, essentially escape velocity coming back too. So I mean, it's 26, 28,000 miles an hour, somewhere in there. And when you hit at that speed, it's just like a meteor, and you ionize the gases around you to where you're cut off from radio communication. And normally it's about 3 minutes.
As far as I'm concerned, the most spectacular part of the mission that I experienced was the re-entry and landing. I mean, that is spectacular. Coming back in at 36,000 feet per second, 25,000 miles an hour, and you are hauling the mail across the surface of the Earth.
I remember this spectacular green ionized flame pattern that is 20, 30, 40, 50 miles long. I don't know how long that thing was.
When we looked down at the islands in the South Pacific, they were going by so fast, it was unbelievable. And the dynamics of it is so rapid. You hit the atmosphere, and 8 minutes later, the parachutes are open. So it's a very, very rapid event.
Go ahead.
Roger, the Hornet is on station, just far enough off the target point to keep from getting hit. Hornet reports a sonic boom a short time ago. I'm in Houston, and the blind air boss has a visual contact.
One of my jobs, sitting in the right-hand seat with a little window in front of me, was to take a 16-millimeter camera and mount it in the window. After the main chutes came out, take and dismount the camera and set it in a bag next to my seat. During the entry, everything went as planned, but somehow I got behind the checklist, and when it came time to dismount the camera, for some reason, I decided not to take it off the bracket and put it in the bag. When we hit the water, that camera and bracket came off the mount, which I didn't know it would do, but such a hit, and it hit me right here. In fact, I thought that if that thing had hit me in the middle of the head, it might have killed me, because it really came off there. And fortunately, it hit me a glancing blow, and apparently it knocked me a little unconscious. It was luck, because I think if I'd had a little bad luck, I could have gotten killed right there just because I didn't follow the checklist.
And what's the first thing Conrad does? The next guy to go to the moon is his best friend Jim Lovell, who's going to fly on Apollo 13. And on 12, they had gone over the landing site for 13, which was up in the mountains of the moon for the first time. I mean, Conrad and Armstrong had both landed on the plains, where it was very flat. Lovell's supposed to land up in the mountains. And so Conrad comes back and goes up to his friend. In fact, doesn't even say it to Lovell. He says it to Marilyn Lovell, Jim's wife. He says, well, you know, we went over Jim's landing site while I was up at the moon. And he says, really? What did it look like? And he just goes, you know, I mean, that's the kind of games they'd play on each other.
If you lose your sense of humor, if you lose your ability to laugh at yourself in these things, then you are a bunch of robots, and you probably are going to go bananas or have ulcers or whatever it takes. So, you know, I think that a certain amount of levity is almost a requirement to keep your sanity within the astronaut group, within the ground group. And I think that we laughed at each other and laughed with each other, and I found that to be the right thing.
Pete Conrad went on to become the commander of the first crew to fly to America's space station Skylab in May 1973 and stayed there for 28 days. After retiring from NASA, he became a vice president of the space division at McDonnell Douglas, conducting research on a new generation of single-stage to orbit spaceships. Alan Bean became the commander of the second mission to Skylab in July 1973 and stayed there for 59 days. After leaving NASA, he has pursued a career as an artist, painting dozens of scenes from the Apollo missions,
portraying the feeling and adventure of what the Apollo program was all about. Dick Gordon was originally slated to become the commander of the Apollo 18 moon mission, but all of the lunar trips after Apollo 17 were canceled in the budget cuts of 1972, and he never flew again. After leaving NASA, he joined a Japanese company, helping them to gather American and Russian space artifacts for a space museum and theme park in western Japan. Apollo 12's tremendous success with a pinpoint landing on the moon, flawlessly setting up several scientific experiments on the lunar surface, and bringing back almost 100 pounds of moon rocks, set the standard of excellence for all subsequent Apollo missions.
It's like a bunch of, teenagers going on a camp out, is sort of the attitude that they went into it with. And they really did have a good time. And still did everything they were supposed to do. I mean, did a terrific good job. You can enjoy yourself in life and still do a good job. And they really proved it. You can go to the moon and enjoy yourself and still do a good job.
History has recorded the facts of Apollo 16 as the fifth manned mission to the lunar surface. But the facts don't tell the whole story. The crew accumulated more memories during their 11-day flight than most people acquire in a lifetime. The mission was commanded by veteran astronaut John Young, with rookies Charles Duke and Thomas Ken Mattingly. This is their story. The story of Apollo 16 actually began in the days just before the launch of the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission. The prime crew of Apollo 13 originally consisted of James Lovell, Fred Hayes, and T.K. Mattingly, while the backup crew consisted of John Young, Charles Duke, and Jack Swigert. The prime crew of Apollo 13 spent years together training for this mission and were prepared for the flight of their lives until fate altered their flight plan.
2 days before they were supposed to go, Charlie Duke, who was on the backup crew, was exposed to the measles, came down with the measles, and of course then exposed everybody in the prime crew. And Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes had had the measles when they were kids, but Ken Mattingly, who was the command module pilot, had never had the measles. So the doctors bounced him from the flight and replaced him 2 days before blastoff with a guy named Jack Swigert, who had been his backup. I mean, and they had never done a crew change that close to a flight before. Never did it again.
I had everything to do with TK not flying on Apollo 13. Had he gotten German measles on the way, when he was out there or on the moon or around the moon, that would have been horrible. He could have been sick. It could have been life-threatening, and from the standpoint of the mission, he would not have been able to perform.
Having concentrated 7 days a week, 24 hours a day on an event that's suddenly denied for what you feel is an unreasonable reason, even though intellectually you know that it's a sound decision, emotionally you feel like you've been cheated from something important.
I don't blame Tom Mattingly for being upset about it, because I think he knew in his own mind that he probably was immune and that it wasn't going to be a problem, but we had no way of proving that. And I've apologized to him profusely many times since then, but I think he's gotten over it.
On April 13th, 1970, only 2 days after the Apollo 13 mission began, one of the oxygen tanks on board the spacecraft blew up and ruptured the backup oxygen tank, causing the spacecraft to lose electrical power, water, and oxygen. This forced the crew to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. Astronauts Young, Duke, and Mattingly worked feverishly for 5 days straight with thousands of fellow astronauts, engineers, and scientists to help bring this crew back alive. The Apollo 13 successful return was a brilliant demonstration of human ingenuity in a life-or-death situation. Mattingly's contribution to the success of bringing his friends back alive certainly did not go unnoticed by NASA management. Deke Slayton, head of the astronaut office and in charge of the crew selections, made sure that Mattingly's actions were duly acknowledged.
I don't remember what the regular sequence was. It was like 3 flights. If you were back up from one, you would expect to fly as a prime crew on about 3 flights down the chain. I don't know when, but not too long after the mission was over, Deke told me that I'd have another chance to go fly. So I still came out of being pretty lucky, and in retrospect, we know I came out very lucky.
Young, Duke, and Mattingly continued to work loosely together for about a year, until they were officially designated as the prime crew of Apollo 16.
The Apollo 16 mission objectives were to land at Descartes in the lunar highlands and to bring back the rocks, put out the lunar scientific experiment package, and do all the things you had to do in 3 days of exploration of the surface up there.
But John Young was a test pilot still is today. And you got everything out of John Young that you could ever ask for. If you asked him to do something, he was going to get it done. Because he does things the right way, the best way, and gets what you ask for. Charlie Duke is very much the same way in terms of responding to people's requirements. Charlie Duke also was one of those guys that had a very great sense of humor. And I think that he was a natural adjunct to John Young.
A typical day in training for us is a hard day. We got started early in the morning. Generally, we'd have 4 or 5 hours in the simulator. We'd then spend an afternoon in lunar surface type training, putting on our suits and practicing either getting suited up in the lunar module or either going out on the simulated rock pile we had down in Florida to practice putting our experiments out.
Being able to find the kinds of rocks of interest among all the various kinds of rocks up there, we went through a lot of training exercises to teach them to recognize rocks that we thought would be interesting. Well, we went to several places where rocks are exposed well, basically in the western United States. We went to Hawaii and looked at volcanic rocks, basaltic rocks out there. Those were the basic areas we went to.
We'd had a lot of training in geology. We'd been, actually, Charlie Duke and I had been training for lunar geology since 1960s, early 1960s. So we had a lot of training and pretty much knew what kind of rocks to pick up.
But I was just talking with one of the guys who worked with Charlie Duke and John Young on the 16 crew, and he was describing an incident where when we did our training exercises, we had the guys wired with radios like they were going to be on the moon, and they were talking to a back room. And they started screaming about how they really found this really neat rock and how there was really life on the moon, and what they found was a rattlesnake. And when they got up there, they were kind of jumping around and jumping away from it. It was quite amusing.
Another aspect of the training was the preparation for the long treks ahead in the innovative Lunar Rover. After the shakedown tests done on Apollo 15, this rover would allow Young and Duke to go further and faster than ever before on the lunar surface.
The Rover was really a unique car. It was electric. It had 2 batteries. Each wheel had its own electric motor, so it was 4-wheel drive. They had a double steering system. In other words, you could steer with the front end and the back end. It had a handle that sat between the seats that was the total control over it. You push the handle forward to go forward, pull the handle back to put on the brakes. If you wanted to turn left, you push the handle left, and the car, of course, turned left. It was a highly maneuverable machine.
We had a centrifuge rig that put you at 1/6 gravity. I ran 13 miles or something over there one time just to prove that you could get back in case you ran out of, in case your Lunar Rover stopped driving, that you could still get back.
While Young and Duke were spending most of their time simulating their anticipated experiences on the lunar surface, Mattingly was busy setting records in the command module simulators.
One of the things that I think is one of NASA's major accomplishments is in preparing flight crews, they have these simulations which are extraordinarily realistic for the ground controllers and for the flight crews and for the team as an organized group. And I think that's the key to why they've been so successful.
And he was good. I mean, so we're like, he was the world record holder for hours in the simulator. I mean, he had simulated this flight for a couple of 100 hours. You know, he was ready.
After having spent well over 2 years in training and about 2,000 hours in simulators and test facilities, the crew was finally quarantined in anticipation of their historic mission.
One of the funny things that happened during a flight, I have a twin brother named Bill, and Bill's a doctor in our hometown in South Carolina. Before the flight, we were in quarantine. My brother had come down with his family and was staying at the Holiday Inn in Cocoa Beach, and then he's walking by the pool, and there's all the NASA management there, Rocco Petrone and George Lowe and a few others, and they looked at him, and their initial thought, we found out later, was, this guy's broken quarantine. What's Duke doing out here? He's supposed to be in quarantine. So they called up out there, what's Duke breaking quarantine? And, you know, the guy picks up, well, he's right here. What do you mean he's not breaking quarantine? So everybody had a big laugh over that.
Once young Duke and Mattingly were strapped in, there was nothing more that they could do but sit there and ride on 7.5 million pounds of thrust once the launch began. Their heart rates that were monitored in mission control proved to be higher during the launch than at any other time in the flight.
Sitting on the top of that critter are three very nervous people. Charlie Duke, Ken Mattingly, and me. People said that when that vehicle left the ground, it shook so much that the ground vibrated. You couldn't prove it by me. I was sitting in the top of it. I think my knees were shaking, but there again it was vibrating so much you couldn't tell.
But I remember the vehicle really started shaking from side to side. It was just a slow acceleration as it lifted off and took 10, 11 seconds to clear the tower, and I thought they'd never say tower clear. And the whole time it was shaking like crazy. I thought there was something wrong with it. I didn't know whether it was going to go into orbit or not. But John was real cool, and he said we'd go, and sure enough, we went, shaking like crazy during the whole first stage.
That was shut down right on the money.
You are go for orbit. Go for orbit.
Downward, go for TLI.
Roger. Guys, I've got the word you wanted to hear. You are go for TLI. You're go for the moon.
After the crew fired their engines for the Trans-Lunar Insertion, or TLI, the main spacecraft containing the crew, known as the Command and Service Module, detached from the fourth stage rocket booster and turned around to pick up the lunar module that was tucked away in the booster.
When we turned around and saw the lunar module, it was like that, and those flakes coming off. It was really scary. We thought we had a fuel leak, but it turned out we didn't.
The crew settled down for their 3-day, 240,000-mile adventure to the moon, while still looking back over their shoulders at the planet they just left.
Yes, we looked out the window, and the Earth was in our window just like that, in the black ground, and it started to get flat. You no longer saw it in 3 dimensions. It's about that time when you're going to the moon. I personally and the other fellows that were with me, we started to wonder if we hadn't bitten off more than we could chew.
They'll talk to you about the Earth, more than the moon, more than anything else. I mean, they'll talk poetry about what the Earth looks like as you're getting 10,000 miles and 20,000 miles and 50,000 miles and 100,000 miles, and and everything you have ever known. You know, I mean, like the whole history of the human race is getting to the point where you can cover it up with your thumb. And that's a very powerful psychological force.
After 3 days filled with anticipation, the Apollo 16 crew finally reached its destination. Young and Duke entered the lunar module Orion, while Mattingly stayed in the Command and Service module Casper.
Go, Sergeant, go. Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Just after the lunar module detached from the command module, Mattingly tested the main engine's primary and backup steering systems before he was to fire the engine to correct the spacecraft's orbit. Mattingly found that the primary steering system worked perfectly, but when the backup system was used, the entire spacecraft unexpectedly oscillated violently. The failure of either primary or backup steering systems was cause for a mission abort. If this problem proved to be a system failure, then the crew would have to return home immediately and hope that the remaining steering system would not fail as well.
Set you up for the next one. Get them back together, get the things back that they want them, get them mentally prepared to do what they're going to do.
But now, don't take that as input. I'm not talking out loud. I want to say something unless I'm sure of it.
I don't see any way we can continue on. Okay.
It looked like we were going to abort, and you can imagine the disappointment we had at this point to think that we were going to have to abort the mission. We'd come through 240,000 miles, and we'd been training for 3 years almost, and here we are 8 miles away from our landing site. We can see it, and they're about ready to tell us to come home.
Will you confirm forward on me?
I just don't much see how we can make it on this next trip. I think you guys ought to continue to work.
You'd say you'd only do it if you had a failure on the primary. Well, how would you ever get the damn thing trimmed then?
Well, I would, if I had a failure in a primary, I'd shut it down.
Coming back kind of initially from...
With the near-fatal Apollo 13 mission still fresh in everyone's memory, all of NASA's engineers, astronauts, and contractors immediately swung into action to either help Mattingly solve the problem or abort the mission and get the whole crew back home safely as soon as possible.
Well, that's another one that they're working.
So they started looking to see what the options were from a trajectory point of view. And in the midst of this, some of these simulations started to surface in the back of people's minds. We had another rule in the simulation that's important to remember, that you never quit until you'd reached a stable or a safe position. You know, while things are out of control, no matter what the simulation was scheduled for, you would continue to run it until the team had found a solution.
Meanwhile, Young and Duke were sweating things out in the lunar module, not sure whether they'd have to abort the mission and redock with Mattingly in the command module, or if they would be able to continue with their mission.
For about 4 or 5 hours, I figured we didn't have a prayer at landing on the moon. Because of that engine, we was going to have to turn around and come home as quick as we could.
It was discovered that a broken wire in the backup system caused the oscillations and vibrations. Mattingly would have no real troubles in steering once the main engine fired. After a lot of nail biting, the crew was given the green light to proceed with a lunar landing.
Well, have at it, babe. So we're going to try it. And you do have a go for another try here.
From the time that we would see the spacecraft on its final pass as we moved towards descent until the time we had landed on the moon was about 30 minutes. We had about 15 minutes to take a look at the spacecraft, make sure everything was go. We had the proper tracking information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the systems were all go, and then we would go through their final series of checks and make the commitment to start the descent to the moon.
Take over, Charlie. Okay, fuel is good, 10%. That comes the shadow. Okay, 200 feet.
The crew is oriented, and they actually start performing what you'd call as a retrograde burn. They're slowing their orbital speed down, so the lunar gravity starts pulling the spacecraft down towards the moon.
Looking good. Perfect place over here, John. A couple of big boulders. Not too bad. Okay, 80 feet. Down at 3. Looking super. There's
You see the shadow stop. That means he's leveled off.
Okay.
And you see the engine blowing out the dust just everywhere. Because the moon is covered with dust very, very fine like powder. The little black rods you see below the landing pads are electrical probes, and when they hit the moon, they turn on the lights at contact, you shut the engine down, and you dropped in the last 4 feet. And it was like, Yahoo, Houston, old Orion is finally here.
Finally here, Houston. The mysterious and unknown detract, silent plane, Apollo 16 is going to change your image. And it started frame count number 4. Okay, Bravo 4, and keep count of how many times you blow off the dust. Well, it didn't work, so... Oh, look, this thing says lock on it, Charlie. Okay, this goes to the other seat. Charlie, this thing tells you what to do. How about that? The new first. This is so super. Oh, boy. Hey, John, this is perfect with the limb and the rover and you and Stone Mountain and the old flag. Come on out here and give me a salute.
I don't know if you can really tell or not, but on the Earth, with all that equipment on and a backpack, we weighed 360 pounds. We trained in Earth at the block field, as you saw in that film, a lot, and you could barely move your big toes. But when you're on the moon, you only weighed 60 pounds, so the jump was delightful.
There we go.
One of their initial responsibilities was to set up the first space-based telescope, known as the ultraviolet camera and spectroscope. This allowed scientists for the first time to photograph deep space objects without the interference of the Earth's atmosphere, and prove beyond any doubts the many advantages of the moon becoming a perfect base for astronomy. Another experiment package that was to be deployed was a heat flow experiment that was to measure the movement of heat from the moon's interior to its surface. Both Young and Duke had performed the setting up of this experiment hundreds of times in simulations, and had no doubts as to its ultimate success.
One of the big experiments, drilling a hole into the moon while John is working on the power station. Unfortunately, as he walked away, you'll notice his left foot, he gets his foot caught in one of the cables, and just right there he ripped it loose. Unfortunately, that was the electrical power to the experiment I was working on. That cable, cable, cable,
Oh.
cable.
Watch the cable. Cable number 1.
Keep flow. Pull it off. God, sorry. I didn't even know it. I didn't even know it.
That was something I'd done many times in training, and they said it wasn't like that, but they fixed it for Apollo 17. In fact, on Apollo 17, when Jack tripped over the central station, they drug the whole thing along, didn't hurt anything, so they fixed it real good. We should have had it fixed for Apollo 16. There's another case where you find out something in training and you don't do something about it, it bites you.
Perhaps the most visually spectacular aspect of this mission to the viewing public back home was when the crew took their rover out to sites far beyond where they landed.
Here I am getting in the car, and we jump up and land on the car seat. Then we had to buckle our seatbelt because the ride across the moon was rough. No roads up there, but fortunately no traffic either, so you just let her go, and the object is not to run over any great big rocks or to run in any great big holes. We set the moon speed record on Apollo, at least we say we did, which was 11 miles an hour, which was felt like we were literally flying.
I think that the thing I remember about Apollo 16 was John Young driving that rover around the surface of the moon, trying to figure out what its capabilities were, turning that thing around corners and driving it like it was a Le Mans race. I thought that was fantastic.
All the traverses were designed so that the furthest point away was early in the traverse, so you'd still have the oxygen to get back in case you did something like knock a wheel off a rover. Always a possibility in those block fields that you could go in there and tear the axle right off.
Before I went to the moon, I had this dream about we were going across the lunar surface, actually driving north in the car, and we'd driven a mile or more, and when we came over the ridge, there was another car, similar to our car, with two shapes in it. It looked like two astronauts, and it was just sitting there. All this is all in my dream now. I ran over there and pulled the visor up so we could see who it was, and as I pulled the visor up on the person on the right, I was looking at myself. Turned out astronauts were dead, and
Charlie didn't tell me that dream before he went, and I was glad he didn't. I would not like to have known that.
There's a rock in the near field on this rim that has some white on the top of it. We'd like you to pick it up as a grab sample. This one right here? That's it. This one right here? That's it. You got it right there. Okay, that's a football-sized rock. It's a great Scott size. Sure you want a rock that big, Houston?
Even though Mission Control had Young and Duke working hectically to accomplish their duties by picking up moon rocks and setting up experiments, there was still enough time to take advantage of their unique view of Earth.
And that's what you can see when you get on the moon. The Earth is 230 or 40,000 miles away, and when you hold up your thumb like this, you can only see the blue clouds, the blue surface and the clouds, and you can hold up your thumb and cover up the Earth. And if that doesn't worry you, well, nothing ever will.
And I do remember one time holding my hand up, and underneath my hand was the Earth. And a thought passed my mind that, underneath my hand is 5 billion people, or 4 billion, whatever it was in those days. And that you don't see North America or Europe, you just see Earth. And I discovered that just seeing Earth as one doesn't make us one. You got to have a heart change inside, and that's what is going to make us one, is that we get a change of heart, and only God can do that for a person.
While Young and Duke were busy setting up experiments and collecting lunar samples, Mattingly was busy in the command module conducting 15 experiments on his own. Along the way, Mattingly also set the U.S. record for the longest solo flight of 81 hours and 40 minutes, a record that still stands today.
The command module pilots, stayed in orbit all by themselves, half of which they were on the dark side of the moon and couldn't even talk to Earth if they wanted to. So they had plenty of time to kind of sit back and just look around and realize, wow, I'm at the moon. They carry music with them. Every astronaut was allowed to carry a tape of their own favorite tunes. And I know Ken Mattingly on 16 carried classical music. He was a big fan, and he picked out songs that he thought would be appropriate to space travel, like Holst's Suite for Planets and the theme song from 2001, and Symphonie Fantastique. And he's listening to the Symphonie Fantastique floating around behind the moon. That's the kind of thing that a command module pilot got to do.
The Moonwalks, they invited the families to come mission control. So we went over there during the 7 hours, 3 days for 7 hours, and watched the moonwalk. It was really great to be able to see it on the big screen at mission control. Toward the end of each day, my heart would start beating a little bit, thinking, oh, now it's time to get in, get in there before anything happens.
We have a few minutes left, so we decide to do the Moon Olympics. I decide to try to set the high jump record on the moon. And as I start to do that, I bounce a couple of times, and then I fall over backwards. And as I fall over backwards, fear strikes. If I split my suit open, I'm dead. As John helps me up, I get very, very quiet as I listen to the pumps and the oxygen flow in the suit. Fortunately, the suit holds, and my fear subsides.
The size of that biggie, it is a biggie, isn't it? It may be further away than we think. No, it's not very far. It was just right beyond you. And we better press on for the big boulder. Okay, we're headed that way. You get the tongs, John? Yep.
It was characteristic for all astronauts to be visually unprepared for adjusting to scale or distances on the moon. Because of the moon's much smaller size, the horizon drops off much quicker than on Earth, and there are simply no landscape markers or geological points that the astronauts could judge distances with.
Probably is. Okay, that sounds like a good guess.
God, you mean they weren't at it? No. It looked like they were standing right there.
Look at the size of that rock.
The rock that Young and Duke thought was just medium-sized and not too far away turned out to be as large as a house and ended up being much farther away than anyone had expected. They aptly named it the House Rock.
Well, Tony, that's your house rock right there. Very good. Don't get too near the edge of that thing. It falls off. Look over at your right. It falls off pretty good. Yeah, I know.
Keep going. During the mission, there I am bouncing around on the moon, and my brother walks into mission control. He gets a pass, and he wants to sit on the flight surgeon's console. And a few people knew he was coming in, but I mean, the whole room looked over, I understand, looked at him, and they looked at the TV, and they looked at, and they thought what's happened here? And then all of a sudden they realized
the word got around my brother, but he looked good. I mean, we are identical. So, that created a few stares and a few laughs in mission control.
Just before Young and Duke had to go back into the lunar module for the last time, Duke left a small token of himself and his family on the moon's dusty surface.
An idea we had before the flight just to get the whole family involved was to have a picture taken. So we had a picture taken of our family in the backyard of our house. On the back of this photograph of our family, we wrote something to the effect of, this is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke from planet Earth, who landed on the moon in April of 1972, and so I pitched it out on the moon and took a picture of the picture.
After being on the moon for about 3 days, and having spent 3 EVAs, or extravehicular activities, collecting over 200 pounds of moon rocks and other samples, both Young and Duke entered the lunar module for the last time and prepared to take off for a rendezvous with Mattingly in the command module.
This is the Ascent stage sitting on the moon just before lunar liftoff. The top part of that machine goes, and the bottom part stays on the surface. That's very interesting, too. We know that there are 200 ways that the lunar module engine could fail to start. It was a pretty tense time. Think of that, 200 ways to become the first permanently manned lunar base.
It's the only part of the entire vehicle that had no backup. You know, I mean, because like NASA was very safety conscious. Every system was double redundant. They had 3 of something, you know, I mean, but they only had 1 engine to take off. And so they made the simplest engine they could build. You know, I mean, it was a very simple and straightforward engine, and you turned it off and it went on, hopefully.
Smile. FAO. Don't be mad. We'll get it up there. See how nice and leisurely it's been? That's the way it should be, getting ready for Ascent. 10 seconds.
I was starting to form this thought. It didn't light. Just then the engine lit, and bang, it kicked us. And then from then on, it was a wild ride. It was like riding a fighter plane, and it was some ride, man. Feel this baby go, and that was the feeling we had then. And it was just exhilaration riding this thing back in orbit.
And right there is the descent stage, and back there is the rover. And if you look real close, you can see tire tracks and footprints all over the place. But if we accept the thing that the President said we would do, more human solar system exploration, you know, it won't be too many years before somebody would be wanting to pave a lunar freeway right through this place. A lot of people think that we did all this moon work in a secret movie lot in Arizona. And this proof positive that we were there. And of course, I have the gray hairs, and so does Charlie Duke, to prove that we were up there.
Especially the old-timers in South Carolina, you know, we did it with mirrors in Arizona or something, you know. It's amazing how many people don't believe we actually went to the moon. And I tease everybody. I say, well, I don't know where they sent those other guys, but I know they sent me to the moon.
Once the crew of Apollo 16 was reunited, the samples and experiments collected in the lunar surface were transferred into the command module. The ascent stage of the lunar module was jettisoned, but its movement afterwards became unstable and unpredictable, requiring the crew to take evasive action to avoid a collision. Before leaving the moon's orbit, the astronauts released a 6-sided satellite designed to orbit the moon and monitor the solar wind, interplanetary magnetic field, and deviations in the moon's gravitational pull.
Shortly thereafter, we turned our spaceship around so we could see the moon, and the moon literally just began. We were climbing so fast, the moon just literally just began to shrink, just like that. And you could see it. I mean, literally a whole satellite that big, 2,000 miles in diameter, just begin to shrink like this. And that was really spectacular. Then we had to settle down for the 3-day trip home. But that first hour or so was, we were glued to the windows watching that.
While on the outbound trip to the moon, Mattingly lost his wedding ring. After searching in vain for over 7 days, he had given up hope of ever finding it. One of the crew's final responsibilities was to retrieve the film canisters of photos Mattingly took of the lunar surface and experiments that were conducted while in lunar orbit. With Duke standing in the open hatch, Mattingly conducted a 1 hour and 24-minute tethered EVA. It was during this EVA that Duke saw the ring float out of the spacecraft.
And so I float over after it and try to grab it, and I miss it, and it floats outside. And, well, my first thought, well, lost in space, there it goes. It floated out and hit him on the back of the head, which he didn't feel, of course. I watched this thing hit, and instead of bouncing off and cartwheeling off into space, it hit and came straight back towards the hatch. It floated back in the hatch, and I grabbed it on the rebound.
After a relatively uneventful 3 days, the crew prepared to return back to Mother Earth, heavily laden with film, experiments, and moon samples.
I think we've seen as much in 10 days as most people see in 10 lifetimes.
That is beautiful, isn't it?
Now they're blooming. Beautiful. There they are. Beautiful.
Apollo Control Houston, an observer on the Ticonderoga estimates the distance from the ship about 1 mile.
Well, the complete mission, this is true. We've always had, I won't say it's a superstition. If you look at a lot of the hype you see in TV and movies, they see us celebrating virtually every event in the mission. That is not the case. We celebrate only when the crew is safely in Apollo on board the deck of the carrier. Basically, we hold back until we are absolutely sure that our job is done. Then we will sit back and we will celebrate.
You saw an example of goal-oriented teamwork in action. The kind of thing that made this country great and the kind of thing that's going to keep it that way.
Thank God for America, and thank God for this country that has let us work in such a marvelous program. Then we passed around cigars in this thing. And this is when we could smoke in the control center. People would do this, and we'd light up the cigars. And that was, hey, our thanks to the team. And there was just a feeling of togetherness, bond, unity, accomplishment. It was just the most marvelous feelings in my entire life that existed in this room.
Well done, young man. Outstanding. I cannot touch that cigar anymore. I cannot.
The house was full of gin, and the champagne bottles were ready to unpour it. At this point, they did. They just popped the champagne bottles as soon as that splash came, and we were celebrating. Cigars came out of mission control, but we had the champagne.
The whole mission in Apollo 16, I added up one time when we finished, we had more than 100 different problems. Main highlights were doing the job in the face of all the problems that we had. It was proof that you could get out there and do it and do the complete mission in spite of problems. We had a lot of problems, but that's the way life is, I think. Solving problems in real time is what this bunch around here is really good at.
After the successful conclusion of this mission, the crew went on a brief celebration trip around the United States and were received like the heroes they are.
I mean, the country was really nice. My hometown had, I mean, they put on a great big celebration, Charlie Duke Day, and we had a little town of 8,000 or 9,000 people. There must have been 40,000, 50,000 people show up from, I mean, every community around, and the governor was there of South Carolina. And everywhere we went around the country, we just got a wonderful reception, and that was nice to be an American, to have been involved in a program that people are proud of, that brought the country together rather than split the country.
John Young went on to become the commander of the very first shuttle mission in 1981, and also commanded a second shuttle mission 2 years later, setting the record for the most trips into space. Young decided to stay with NASA as the special assistant to the director of the Engineering, Operations, and Safety Division at NASA's Johnson Space Center. His 30 years of service as an astronaut was recently honored when he was awarded the Outstanding Leadership Medal by NASA's administrator, Dan Golden.
Recently, John was asked why, after such a lifetime of achievement, after so many other astronauts have retired, that he still came to work at NASA day after day. And he said simply, because there's so much left to do.
T.K. Mattingly stayed with NASA as well, and also commanded 2 shuttle missions in 1982 and 1985. After leaving NASA, Mattingly entered the private sector in the aerospace field, and is currently the vice president in charge of the designing and building of Lockheed Martin's X-33, the next generation of NASA's spacecraft. Charles Duke left NASA shortly after his flight and became a very successful businessman. Perhaps the most lasting effects of Apollo 16 are the implications of what this mission meant to people of the world and long-term prospects for the future of humanity in space.
I prefer to believe that challenges, things that are stimulating, are the kinds of things that make societies healthy. I think that you cannot retain a healthy society without giving yourself some kind of a challenge to draw the best out of you.
I thought when we left the moon that we'd have a base up there in a couple of years, but we didn't do it. I think it's time for us to look at going back to the moon now. We're right now, the United States is where Columbus was 500 years ago. The time is to get out there and discover these places, investigate and expand our knowledge, and then apply that knowledge to solving problems here on the Earth. We need to get smarter, and we need to learn better how to control our destinies, and I think space exploration is a key to that.
I know I thought that I probably would have aspirations going to Mars. Somewhat naively, in retrospect, I assumed that we'd go to the moon and then just press right on to the next destination.
The future of humanity may well depend on our ability to conquer space. This Apollo 16 crew and the program as a whole laid the foundations for all that followed.
When I look up at the moon, especially on a real bright, clear night, and it's almost full, it's this feeling of, attaboy, I've been there, and it's still a thrill just to look up and still look up and say, that's where I was, and it just, the memories just flood through my mind, and it still brings back lots of excitement.
The eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
On the 25th of May, 1961, President John F. Kennedy of the United States of America committed the resources of his nation and launched Project Apollo, the greatest technological undertaking in the history of mankind.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
This was the race to space, working to beat the Russians. And the enthusiasm was absolutely tremendous.
People were absolutely glued to their televisions. It was a transformative event in human history.
The Eagle has landed.
1/5 of humanity watched Neil Armstrong's footsteps in 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
But only 2 years later, in 1972, public and political interest in Apollo had dwindled. NASA was forced to cancel their last 3 missions, making Apollo 17 man's final mission to the moon. Astronauts Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans were the 3 brave men chosen to fly NASA's final mission. They have been written up in history books and acknowledged by the space and scientific communities, but have never received the public recognition they truly deserved. Yet Apollo 17's voyage to the moon was the crowning glory of man's lunar exploration.
Apollo 17 broke so many records.
This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you.
The crew spent 3 days on the lunar surface. Their moonwalks lasted 8 hours. They covered a greater distance than any other mission.
The scientific legacy of Apollo 17 has been enormous. Had Apollo 17 not happened when it did, I shudder to think really what textbooks would have to say, even now, about the early history of the solar system.
Man, I covered ground like a kangaroo.
Apollo 17 did mark the end of an era. Since then, we haven't travelled into space as far.
Apollo 17 is the hidden jewel of the US lunar space program.
The world knows how the Apollo program began, but very few truly understand how it ended. This is the remarkable story of the determination and courage of a generation. A tribute to 3 brave astronauts and the thousands of men and women behind them during the final days of NASA's Apollo program.
Here man completed his first exploration of the moon. In the spirit of peace of all mankind.
In 1961, when President Kennedy launched the Apollo program, the space age was only in its 4th year. The commitment of sending a man across the hostile ocean of space to the moon was bold but necessary. America urgently needed a powerful demonstration of its technological superiority to convince the world that it could still contain the threat of Soviet aggression.
I think the Americans were very confident that they had a much superior system. They were looking towards the Soviet Union as a pretty backward society. And then all of a sudden, on the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the planet. That put the Americans, certainly at a cultural level, into a bit of a panic. It's fair to say that if the Americans had put the first human being into space, then we wouldn't have had the political drive for success that culminated in Project Apollo in the 1960s.
The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA,
began assembling a task force of 400,000 top scientists and technicians that over the next 7 years would develop the vast spectrum of technologies needed to put a man on the moon.
I got involved in the Apollo principally because of my, I think, obsession with spaceflight. I started with reading Dan Daring Eagle, like a lot of people did, and then there was an advert in the Daily Telegraph which said they were looking for people to work on the Apollo program in the States. And I thought this was just the bee's knees. So I applied and got the job, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Everybody who worked on Apollo was so enthusiastic. Of course, it was the race to space, and it was just magic.
Involvement in the Apollo program was really a fantastic thing. It seemed that almost anything was possible. I worked for Lockheed Electronics Company, and I supported the Guidance and Control Division laboratory. It was exciting at times, it was scary at times, but working on it gave a sense of achievement.
Kennedy's dream was finally realized in July 1969 when Apollo 11 touched down on the lunar surface, marking man's most significant accomplishment in the history of exploration. Photographs of flags and footprints were beamed around the world. America's prestige had been re-won, and they established themselves as the world's superpower. Politically, the race to beat the Russians to the moon had been won, but NASA's scientific mission was just beginning. Over the next 2 years, their confidence and proficiency in lunar exploration went from strength to strength. But in 1970, despite this monumental achievement, the 10 proposed missions were cut short, making Apollo 17 NASA's final lunar mission.
The public was losing interest because they just saw people going to the moon time and time again, apparently doing the same things, not realizing what science was being done. So with a lack of public interest, the government started to lose interest.
Scientifically, it's a tremendous loss, and had 18, 19 and 20 been allowed to continue, then there's no doubt that our knowledge of the moon and the history of the early solar system would be much bigger now than what it is had those missions continued. So scientifically, there was every reason to continue them.
If Apollo 17 was to be the last visit to the moon, NASA needed to make it count. NASA's growing confidence in supporting longer operations meant that Apollo 17 would become the most productive lunar mission of the entire program.
Apollo 17 was a mission of superlatives in so many ways, and it broke so many records. The crew spent 3 days on the lunar surface. Their moonwalks lasted 8 hours. They covered a greater distance than any other mission. And yet by December 1972, most of the American public and much of the global public had lost interest completely. So I always think of Apollo 17 as being the hidden jewel of the US lunar space program.
Apollo 17's mission commander was former U.S. Navy pilot and veteran astronaut Eugene Cernan. He is one of only 3 men who have voyaged to the moon twice. Cernan first flew on the Gemini program and later became the lunar module pilot on Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal for the lunar landing, where he flew within 15 kilometers of the surface. Cernan had to wait 3 years and 6 missions until he would fly again and finally set foot on the moon.
Gene Cernan was very good. He was very, very competent, and all these people were so keen to do a good job on the moon. It was really amazing. They really wanted to put our hardware out there and get it working and get the science.
Command Module pilot Ronald Evans was selected late into the Apollo program while flying combat missions in Vietnam. Apollo 17 would be his first and only spaceflight. Joe Engle was the proposed lunar module pilot, but after Apollo 18 was canceled and it became clear that this would be the final lunar mission, the scientific community pressed NASA to select a scientist astronaut to go to the moon. Engle was dropped from the program, and Harrison Schmitt, also known as Jack Schmitt, took his place to become the first and only geologist to step foot on the moon.
Jack Schmitt was picked as one of the first 6 original scientist astronauts in 1965. People said he had a fanatical focus upon Apollo. There were some of his colleagues who doubted that he had any other life apart from Apollo. But he got himself noticed for the right reasons, totally committed, changed geology training for the astronauts, raised the profile of geology within the entire program.
I met Harrison Schmitt on Apollo 15. He was the backup lunar module pilot. The experiments that I was working on had to be exercised by each crew member before we loaded them into the lunar module and sent them off to the moon. So Harrison Schmitt came over to have a look at the experiments and picked up the magnifying glass, and he looked at it and he said, "Do you know what a geologist does when he finds a rock to look at?" And we said, "No." And he said, "He does this." He said, "Have you ever tried doing that in a spacesuit?" But he was a great guy to work with, very easy and very professional, as most of them were.
On the 6th of December, 1972, the countdown to launch had begun. On the pad at the Kennedy Space Center stood the enormous Saturn V rocket.
It is still the largest vehicle ever to put human beings in space. It weighed about 6.8 million pounds. The thrust of the first stage was 7.5 million pounds. Just a really remarkable accomplishment. The one thing that I don't think anybody in this business ever feels is fear. Otherwise, you would not be out there walking to the rocket. You better have gotten used to that idea a long time ago. The thing that's different about launch day is that the launch pad is empty. There's nobody else there but you. Once that van drops you off at the spacecraft and you get in that elevator, you get in the elevator alone. Any other time you're out there looking at things, there are people all, like ants, they're everywhere, but not that night. And then we went across the catwalk to the command module hatch. It was a steel mesh floor. So walking over, you could look down and see the whole thing. Most everybody gets a little bit of a feeling in their stomach when they do that.
Roger. Flight booster. Go. S4B pre-press complete. Roger.
Flight booster. S1C pre-press complete. We're on internal power and we'll go.
At 12:33 on the morning of December 7th, 1972, they got the go for launch.
Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
Sequence initiated. Flight go.
Roger. Flight booster.
20 seconds and counting.
S4B pre-press complete. Roger.
Flight booster. Go.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. Liftoff.
Apollo 17 is the only night launch of the Saturn V rocket. It turned night into day, and even from 500 miles away, it was incredibly bright in the night sky. And I think it was a fitting end to Project Apollo that night launch really summarized what the whole program was about.
17, your go.
17 is go.
You're looking great. Right on the line.
One of the things that you don't get in your training is the physical feeling of the launch.
I got a pitch and a roll program, and this baby is really going.
Roger that. Stand by for mode 1 Bravo.
It's a very heavy, low-frequency vibration. The first thing that I remember thinking was, why did we do all the simulations? Because I couldn't read anything on the gauges. That vibration was something.
3 Gs, 3.5 Gs. Hold on.
Beautiful.
Fido.
Flight Fido, we're go.
Go across the board.
Man. I guess we got all 5.
Yeah, they're looking here. Look good.
We have you go for orbit here. Go for orbit.
Those are kind words, Robert. We're go for orbit here.
We had 2 orbits of the Earth before we were going to restart that third stage rocket that had inserted us into orbit in order to accelerate to 25,000 miles an hour and go to the moon.
At a distance of 45,000 kilometers, the crew took what is believed to be the most widely distributed photographic image of all time. Famously known as the Blue Marble, this incredible image was the first picture of the fully illuminated face of planet Earth.
We are seeing the Earth as it truly is, a grand oasis in the vastness of space.
We take our planet for granted, but seeing it like that, sort of isolated from everything, it just gave a different perspective. And I think in some ways it almost stimulated the environmental movement. We saw our planet as a whole, and we saw it as vulnerable.
The picture of the Earth as a blue marble brought home to people how fragile our Earth is, and how stupid all the arguments are between nations. We're just all on this big spaceship together, and we better get along.
No human being has since been at a distance where taking a whole Earth photograph like this has been possible. Exactly which of the Apollo crew took this amazing image is unclear, but like so many other aspects of the Apollo program, this breathtaking photograph changed our perception of our beautiful planet forever. Apollo 17's landing site was a small valley located in the Taurus-Littrow region. Taurus-Littrow sits close to the edge of an impact basin. This vast basin was formed about 3.9 billion years ago as a result of a comet or asteroid collision. The site's geological significance was of great interest to NASA.
Taurus-Littrow was chosen as a landing site for the last Apollo mission because it was a mixture of highland and lowland terrain. And of course they had a geologist as the principal investigator, if you like, on the mission itself. And I guess he was in his element driving around the moon's surface.
After 4 days and traveling 380,000 kilometers, the crew of Apollo 17 began orbiting the moon.
We, as human beings, committed ourselves to a gravitational field of another planet. And that was the first time. Apollo was the first time that human beings did that. There was no absolute guarantee that you were going to return, but it broke that bond with the Earth that ultimately, I'm sure, will lead humans on a path to the settlement away from our Earth.
Command Module pilot Ronald Evans stayed in lunar orbit conducting experiments, while Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt descended to the surface to complete their research.
Okay, 1511510 entered. 42 degrees, 47 now. 47 degrees through 49 degrees.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guys, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Dellinger, you're go for landing.
I'll need the probe. I'll give it to you. Oh, are we coming in? Oh, baby. It's so hard to describe. It's incredible.
The lunar module pilot doesn't get to look outside very much. My job was to make sure that the commander had information off the computer that would tell him where he was going and gave him information as we got closer and closer to the surface on what his velocity rates were.
Okay, stand by for pitch over. We're level with the top of the Mesquite now.
Roger.
Stand by for pitch over, Jack. Pitch there over. It is. Proceeded. And there it is, Houston. There's Camelot. Wide on target. I see it. We got them all. 42 degrees, 37 degrees, to 5,500. 38 degrees. 3,000 feet. 53 degrees. Okay, I've got Barre, I've got Poppy, I've got the triangle. Fuel is good. 1,500 feet. 54 degrees, Gene. Approaching 1,000. Get through 800 feet. H-dot's a little high. Yeah, I don't need the numbers anymore. Okay, you're 31 feet per second, going down through 500. That's a little high, Gino. Okay. Going down at 5. The fuel's good. 110 feet. Stand by for some dust. Little forward, G. Getting a little dust. You're at 60 feet. Going down about 2. Very little dust. Very little dust. 40 feet. Going down at 3. Stand by for touchdown. Stand by. 25 feet. Down at 2. Fuel's good. 20 feet. Going down at 2. 10 feet. Stand by. 10 feet. Contact. Stop push. Engine stop. Engine arm. Proceed. Command override off. Load control ahead. Hold. Pings auto. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed. Houston, tell America the Challenger is at Taurus-Littrow. Roger, Challenger, that's super.
On December 11th, at 7:54 p.m., the lunar module Challenger touched down on the moon surface.
As I step off at the surface at Taurus-Littrow, we'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. We thank you very much. This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you. Okay, Jack. How about the flag right over here in this little mound? Right there. Watch your fingers. Don't know how far we could throw, but I think you hit something solid with that one. No, it was still going. Yeah, but did you ever see it vibrate like that? No, I've never put a flag up in the moon before. What? Pull that in. You're going to have to get it down to my level. Tall guys are all alike. Okay? That's what it looks like it's waving in the breeze. Yes, sir. How about right there? It does wave when you do that. We got a beautiful picture, you guys, up down there. Let me tell you, Bob, this flag is a beautiful picture.
My first concern stepping on the moon was to stay with the timeline. And as I came down the ladder, I was thinking of how we get maximum use of the time that was available. I had made a calculation at the time. I have no idea whether it was right or not, but that the time on the moon was worth about $1 million a man-minute. And that got my attention. And those were those year dollars, not this year dollars.
How's the TV working? Beautiful. Guess you believe we're here now, huh?
Now we believe you're here. To coin a phrase, it's a panoramic scene of beauty.
Come on now, Bob. Hey, Bob, what do you think of the terrain?
Looks flat. Looks very flat and smooth.
That's why you're an astronomer. Oh, well.
For the first half hour or so, I was in very familiar territory because I was primarily looking at the lunar module. I was working around it. We were unloading things that we would need, including the roving vehicle and things like that. When I first had a chance to move away from the spacecraft, my first duty was to go to the points of an equilateral triangle around the lunar module and take a set of pictures that would give as much of a pristine view of the landing site as we could. And that was the first time I had a chance to really see the lunar module in the context of this place where we had landed. Taurus-Littrow was a deep mountain valley, deeper than the Grand Canyon, as a matter of fact. The mountains on either side rose to 6,000 and 7,000 feet above the valley floor. and were brilliantly illuminated by a sun as bright as one that you can imagine either in high snowfields or in the desert. But they were silhouetted against a black sky, an absolute black sky. And that's what you cannot get from the pictures that are printed, which doesn't give you the contrast that the eye sees when you're there.
Taurus-Littrow was the most dangerous landing site of the entire Apollo program. Although the risks taken to land in the Taurus-Littrow Valley were great, the payoff was the opportunity to sample a larger and more diverse selection of geological material than ever before.
Boy, is that pretty inside. Woo! We haven't seen anything like this. I haven't, unless you've been holding out on me.
The samples returned would contain rock both older and younger than that of any other Apollo mission.
Taurus-Littrow Valley was selected because it was a diverse site geologically. Within an easy driving distance of the landing site, there are these highland blocks, the North Massif and the South Massif. These highland blocks were formed as mountains. Orbital imagery based on photographs taken by Apollo 15 had demonstrated the existence of boulders which had rolled down the mountains from high up on the slopes, where they'd carved tracks. And so accessing these boulders that had rolled down the massifs became a high priority. In addition to these boulders, a small fault runs across the valley called the Lee Lincoln Scarp, which it was considered would be of geological interest. And there was a landslide of clearly light-coloured highland material which had fallen off the South Massif mountain and covered the valley floor. So all in all, it was a very geologically diverse valley where a lot could be explored in the time available to the astronauts with their lunar roving vehicle.
Got a bag? Got a bag. The soil from right underneath the rock.
In addition to their geological studies, Cernan and Schmidt were to perform several experiments. The Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Package, or ALSEP, contained 4 experiments never before deployed on the Moon.
There was a brand new experiment to look at the lunar atmosphere. Now, the lunar atmosphere is a very good vacuum, but there are gases around. And it was a mass spectrometer that could actually detect different kinds of gases. There was a thing called a gravimeter, which was a very, very sensitive gravity measuring device, trying to measure the Moon's gravitational pull, and looking for very, very slow moonquakes to see if they existed. There was the Lunar Ejectron Meteoroid experiment, which was looking for small meteorites coming down and impacting it, dust-sized ones. And then finally, another seismic experiment with explosive charges which were put out on the lunar surface as they drove around in the rover. And then they were fired later on from the Earth. Commands were sent when the crew had left. And they sent seismic shocks quite deeply down into the surface so that we could see what the strata was like underneath the surface of the Moon.
The totality of scientific instruments and measurements deployed on the Moon by Apollo 17, considering it was all done in 3 days and had to be combined with all this driving around and sampling, was really remarkable.
The Lunar Rover was an outstanding vehicle for field exploration. It weighed about 450 Earth pounds without anything on it. It got a little bit heavier as we got on it and put our equipment there. It could go about 6 or 7 miles per hour over that surface. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but I'll tell you, remember 1/6 gravity, you hit a bump and you're going to be off the surface a bit. And it does seem like it's going a lot faster than that. We actually had it up to 18 kilometers an hour, which would be about 12 or 13 miles an hour going downhill once. And I think even Gene Cernan regretted going quite that fast. It was pretty hard. The rover was a very, very productive vehicle and a tribute to the people who designed and built it.
The crew were on their first extravehicular activity, or EVA, when Cernan brushed against the rover. A hammer in the shin pocket of his spacesuit caught the buggy's rear fender and tore it in half.
Oh, you won't believe it. There goes a fender. Yeah, Bob, I got a little bit of a problem here. Oh, shoot.
Gene Cernan turned around and just scraped against the fender of the lunar roving vehicle, and it snapped a little bit of it off. Now, we might think that this was no big deal, but we need to remember, on the surface of the moon, this lunar dust used to get absolutely everywhere. With the lunar roving vehicle travelling at about 10 or 11 miles an hour at top speed, it was throwing lunar dust everywhere. Not only would the astronauts get covered with the material, but the material was very dark. Now remember, in an airless environment, if you're exposed to direct sunlight, you're going to heat up massively. It's one of the reasons that the outer layer of the Apollo astronaut suits were white. And so what seems to us on Earth to be a relatively minor issue was going to seriously compromise the potential science that could have been obtained from the rest of the mission.
Well, everything's getting awful dusty. Everything is just full of dust.
With the dust threatening the astronaut's safety, something had to be done. In spite of his thick gloves, Gene Cernan managed to unroll and tear off strips of duct tape in an attempt to repair the damaged fender.
And Dina, how you doing on that fender? Bob, I am done. If that fender stays on, I'm going to take a picture of it, because I'd like some sort of mending award. Let's hope. Keep your fingers crossed, and I'll be more careful around the fenders. Okay, copy that.
His quick-fix solution held out. For the next 4 hours, they continued to drive the rover without any problem, stopping to drill holes, collect core samples, and deploy seismic charges. But while on a rough patch of lunar terrain, the fender broke again, and a new problem arose. A thick coating of dark lunar dust began covering the rover's batteries, which were now absorbing the heat from the sun and at risk of overheating.
We got pretty dirty. We cleaned our pressure suits between every EVA, but you could see the scratches on the wrists and on the helmet. Good engineering is going to have to keep the dust out of things. It is very abrasive, but you could still see the scratches. Yours truly, it doesn't prove I was on the moon, but I seem to have had an awful good time while I was there, and not at all bashful about standing around in my underwear.
Back at Houston, NASA engineers understood the seriousness of the situation. If they couldn't come up with a solution while Cernan and Schmidt slept, the next day's exploration would be severely inhibited, limiting the astronauts to within walking distance of the lunar module. Apollo 16 commander John Young was on the case.
John Young spent the night working in a spacesuit back at Houston, working out a procedure to fix it. And they worked out that they would use an old map that they'd already been using that they didn't need again. They taped it into a curve and then found 2 little clamps which they could use to clamp it to the dust guard.
When the astronauts woke the next morning, Mission Control had instructions for a replacement fender. The new fender held for the rest of the mission, which was to be another 15 hours of EVAs.
Apollo 17's true science potential was saved by duct tape. Don't go anywhere without it.
Although the Lunar Rover allowed the astronauts to cover great distances, they still had to travel on foot when setting up experiments and collecting samples. They quickly became confident moving in the lower gravity of the moon, which is 1/6 of that on Earth.
Oh, bury me not on a lone prairie where the coyotes howl in the windblown tree. This is the best way for me to travel, uphill or downhill. What's that? Like this, 2-legged hop, and on level ground I can skip. This 2-legged thing is great. Man, I can cover ground like a kangaroo. Whee! I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May's the month. May, that's right. May is the year of the month.
They did, however, end up with their knees in the dust on more than one occasion.
Okay, yep. Remind me to dust my camera too, will you? Don't forget to dust your camera. I'm gonna get this thing out now that I got it. No. Boys, you know, that's what you call getting down into your work. No. Dadgummit. Yeah, would you go over and help Twinkle Toes, please?
Anytime you felt a little bit homesick, you could look up and see the Earth, only 240,000 miles away. I must say, though, that the communications were outstanding. I never felt isolated on the moon at all.
During their second EVA, the crew visited a crater named Shorty Crater. Shorty had excited scientists back on Earth, as it's surrounded by a halo of soil that is significantly darker than the general terrain. After the 7-kilometer drive to Shorty Crater, Harrison Smith looked to the soil stirred up by his feet. He found what is considered to be one of the most significant of all Apollo's discoveries.
Oh, hey! There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange! Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange.
You know, there's a stereotype about science as being dull and unemotional. I think the story of the orange soil on Apollo 17 just blows that myth to pieces, because when you look at the pictures of the moon, they could be colour pictures, but the moon looks pretty grey. And then all of a sudden, on Apollo 17, in this monochrome landscape, you've got bright orange soil appearing. Now, when this was reported, you can hear it in the voices back in mission control. You know, there is orange soil, there's excitement. And I'll never forget that there's one of the geologists supporting the mission, and he is almost shaking with excitement.
Fantastic, sports fans. I've got my tools of the trade right here.
The significance of this was that the orange soil, it was thought, could be evidence of volcanic activity. Now, this landing site had been chosen specifically to try and look for evidence of volcanic activity. So it's, I think the words that Jack Schmitt used were, I think we found what we were looking for.
Oh man, that's incredible. Jack, that is really orange.
When analysed through a microscope, the coloured soil turns out to be made of tiny, tens of micron-sized orange glass beads that's been erupted in a fire fountaining eruption in the Taurus-Littrow Valley. The orange glasses are in fact the youngest samples found in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, but they're still 3.6 thousand million years old. Because the moon seems to be so dry, it had been assumed that the primary volatile responsible for driving these fire fountainings was carbon dioxide gas. But evidence has been found that some of the volatiles responsible for driving this volcanism may have been water after all. And so these glasses are still, 40 years on, actively at the centre of lunar science today.
And as I step out onto the plains of Taurus-Littrow, oh, what a nice day. Oh, funny, there's not a cloud in the sky, except in the Earth.
The astronauts' third and final EVA provided an opportunity to study the large boulders that had rolled down the north wall of the Taurus-Littrow Valley.
This large boulder had rolled down the North Massif about 1.5 kilometers. I'm there for scale. It hit a change in slope and broke into 5 pieces there and stopped. And it has told us a great deal about the nature of these huge impacts that have occurred on the moon and before that occurred on the Earth.
Holy smoly! Why are we on a slope? You okay? It's one of the blue-gray rocks, Bob, and it's got a light-colored fragment that runs the full height of it, about 1.5 meters thick, and then it's got the gray, a blue-gray rock on the other side. Okay. Here I am, folks, in the middle of a boulder field. Just minding my own business.
In lunar orbit, Ron Evans conducted extensive experiments from the command module America, charting the lunar surface using a panoramic camera and laser altimeter. Used in conjunction with other scientific instrumentation, Evans collected more information for accurately mapping the surface of the moon. The invaluable images and data collected by Apollo are still widely used by research scientists and astronomers today.
Ron Evans seemed to have a lot of fun while he was alone up there. One of the problems with the source of our water was that a little bit of hydrogen would leak into the water. And here Ron has worked that hydrogen into a bubble so that he could take it back and demonstrate they had missed getting that hydrogen out. The reason it was important to us is that, you know, what goes in must come out, and much to the discomfort of your crewmates.
Before leaving for the moon, Cernan made a very special promise to his daughter. He told her that he would write her initials in the lunar dust, making her the only little girl on Earth to have her name on the moon. Just before Apollo 17 left the moon, Cernan took a moment to kneel and with a single finger wrote his daughter Tracy's initials, TDC, in the lunar dust, knowing those 3 letters would remain there undisturbed for millions of years.
It's a rock composed of many fragments of many sizes and many shapes. When we return this rock, or some of the others like it, to Houston, we'd like to share a piece of this rock with so many of the countries throughout the world. We hope that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind that we can live in peace and harmony in the future.
Apollo 17 was a record-breaking mission. During their 3 days on the moon, Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt completed 22 hours of lunar exploration and research, more than any other Apollo mission that had gone before. They had driven a total of 34 kilometers through the Taurus-Littrow Valley and positioned the most comprehensive set of instruments ever deployed on the lunar surface. They had collected and documented over 110 kilograms of moon rock and soil and taken over 2,400 photographs. But now, it was time to go home. In their final moments on the moon, Harrison Schmitt made a rather unusual request.
There's an interesting scene from the last moments of the final EVA on the surface of the moon in Apollo 17, and it was Jack Schmitt and his hammer throwing. Now, I'm not sure if this is a geologist tradition or it was just a Jack Schmitt tradition, but when you look at the footage, you can see that Gene Cernan's getting ready to throw it, and Jack really wants to throw it, and Gene Cernan, almost as a recognition of the great work that he's done, says, "Okay, Jack, you go ahead and do it," and you see him throwing it away.
Let me throw the hammer, please. It's all yours. A hammer thrower, you're a geologist, you ought to be able to throw it. You ready? Go ahead. You ready for this? Yeah. Don't hit the limb. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. Looked like it was going 1,000,000 miles, didn't it?
I think that it may well have been an old geologist tradition. I know that a definite geologist tradition is a tradition of rolling pebbles or rolling boulders.
Go, roll! Look, I would roll on this slope, why don't you?
The old boulder rolling trick. Don't hit the rover.
Jack Schmitt indulged that, and he also got Gene Cernan to do that as well, and they did do their rock rolling on the surface of the moon during Apollo 17.
The pressure of producing the speech to draw to an end the first set of manned explorations on the moon fell on mission commander Eugene Cernan. He had prayed that when the time came, he would find words of power and purpose. As he surveyed the lunar landscape for the very last time, he simply spoke from the heart and closed a chapter of human courage, ingenuity, and discovery.
We'd like to uncover a plaque that has been on the leg of our spacecraft that we have climbed down many times over the last 3 days. So that when this plaque is seen again by others who come, they will know where it all started. Here man completed his first exploration of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind. This is our commemoration that will be here until someone like us, till some of you who are out there who are the promise of the future, come back to read it again and to further the exploration and the meaning of Apollo.
Back on Earth at Mission Control, Ed Fendell, who had been responsible for remotely operating the lunar cameras during Apollo 17, was poised to capture the one shot that had eluded NASA over the previous 5 missions. A clean view of the lunar module takeoff. This would be the last chance to get this elusive shot. With a 6-second signal delay, Fendell had to correctly time the movement of the camera with the flight path of the lunar module in advance. The results were truly spectacular.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. That's your grid. Mag spot. Take your final look at the valley at Taurus-Littrow. Good to see you. Good to have you all back up here. It's been a good trip. Man, that Challenger is a beautiful vehicle. You betcha.
Following the rendezvous and docking with Ron Evans in the command module, the crew proceeded to transfer the precious lunar samples and film. Apollo 17 spent an additional 3 days in lunar orbit, conducting yet more orbital science, and they would be the last men to witness the famous Earthrise.
And as we leave the moon in Taurus-Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed, the crew of Apollo 17.
On the return journey, Ron Evans had the chance to complete an EVA of his own. Leaving the safety of the command module, he ventured on a spacewalk to retrieve vital film from the onboard external cameras.
Go now. Am I clear? You're clear, babe. Go. Am I on the tube?
Affirmative. Outstanding quality picture, Ron.
Okay.
Three days later, we've entered the Earth's atmosphere. Our actual entry peaked G's at 7 times gravity, just for an instant, because we wanted to be sure, of course, we were captured in the atmosphere. The command module actually was flown by the computer. At 35,000 miles an hour, almost anything is going to have lift of some kind if you orient it right, and the command module did. At this point, we had gone through the deployment of drogue chutes at 25,000 feet, and then this deployment of the main chutes at about 10,000 feet. And we were moving down towards the water, I believe at about 16 feet per second.
Apollo 17 may have been viewed by many cynics as a lackluster mission. But nothing could be further from the truth. When the crew finally splashed down in the warm blue waters of the Pacific Ocean, it didn't just signify the closing of the Apollo program, but the true end of an era.
Apollo has transformed the way we look at the moon. Apollo has transformed our understanding of the moon's importance. There is a treasure trove of discoveries still to be made from the lunar samples, from the instruments that are still active on the surface of the moon. Yes, it was an incredibly expensive program, but when you've got something which 40 years later is still enabling new scientists to develop new ideas and new theories, then that tells you something about the program's value.
It was an extraordinary period in human history. We gained a first-order understanding of another planet for the first time. And what was accomplished by the generation of Apollo does symbolize a great new understanding of what we now know about the early history of the Earth. It symbolizes a new source of resources for the planet, particularly in energy, and it symbolizes a new path to the settlement of our solar system.
Before we went to the moon, all we knew about it was what we could get from telescopes. Getting to the moon, being able to bring samples back, to be able to make measurements of its atmosphere, its magnetic field, what its structure was, taught us a lot, not only about the moon, but how the Earth and the moon were created originally.
Apollo 17 was the culmination of the whole Apollo program, and it put a very satisfactory line under the whole thing, and scientists are still studying the data brought back by the whole program.
Certainly Apollo 17 was the most productive scientifically in terms of samples returned and scientific instruments deployed.
I think Apollo 17 did mark the end of an era. Since then, we haven't travelled into space as far. That impetus to get out there, to almost travel to the stars, has waned.
It told man that more or less anything was possible.
It brought everybody together. I think for the first time, people all over the world were interested in one thing and what was going on at that one time.
The Apollo missions have ended, but we need something to take its place and something to inspire people and something to get us, as the human race, out there and beyond.
Many believe that a return to the moon holds the key to man's future in space.
We will be going back to the moon. The best move, if we're going to Mars, is to go back to the moon. Because if we can't keep people supported on the moon and keep them in good condition, it's no good going to Mars, because we won't be able to do it when they're a heck of a lot further away.
We can do it. We could go to the moon in the 1960s and 1970s. We could go to the moon now if we had the political willpower and if we decided to put the financing in. None of the astronauts involved would have expected us to be here 4 decades later and still not having seen a return to the moon. But ultimately, the Apollo for our times would be the challenge of getting a human being to Mars. It's not just about exploration, it's about securing the future for humanity. That's what human beings have done throughout history. We have been a species that wants to explore, to push forward our frontiers. The Earth is our cradle, but we can't stay in the cradle forever.
Whatever the future holds, one thing is for sure. Apollo's overwhelming contribution to science has given us a new perspective on the moon, our own unique planet, and the universe beyond.
I was sad that the programme came to an end. Obviously, we'd like it to have gone on much longer. But even though Apollo ended and we were sad, we continued with some really exciting work.
It was a fantastic experience. I definitely feel proud that I was part of the Apollo program, even a very minor cog in a big machine. If I had my time again, I most certainly would move heaven and earth to work on something like that again. It was really fun.
Apollo 17 was a fitting conclusion to a triumphant space program which will inspire future generations for many years to come. What NASA achieved in the decade following Kennedy's pledge is a testament to man's ingenuity.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.